There was a moment in early 1945 when Adolf Hitler made a choice that would echo through the frozen landscape of Hungary and fundamentally alter the final chapter of the Second World War. While Berlin braced itself for what was coming from the east, the German High Command committed its last, most formidable armoured forces not to the defence of the Reich's heartland, but to a distant offensive in a country most Germans had never seen. It was a decision born of desperation, of dwindling resources, and of a hope so fragile it barely withstood examination. Yet in those hours before the offensive began, thousands of tank crews and panzer grenadiers were moving through the darkness toward Hungarian soil, carrying with them the ghost of an army that had once dominated Europe. If you find yourself drawn to the untold human stories within great historical machinery, the small, intimate details of war that sleep documentary exploration can unfold with time and care, I'd invite you to subscribe now so you can follow the complete history of the SS Panzer Divisions in Hungary during their final, desperate last offensive, a saga that's far more complex and haunting than the history books usually allow us to see. Picture it now, the last days of winter, 1945. Across the vast Hungarian plain, a wind moves across fields hardened by frost. The landscape here is almost featureless, flat expanses of white and grey stretching toward a darkening horizon. It is late afternoon, perhaps 4 o'clock, when the light is already beginning its slow retreat. The sky above is pale, nearly colourless, the kind of sky that promises nothing and threatens everything. There is no warmth left in it. The temperature sits somewhere below freezing, and has for weeks. The earth beneath the snow is iron hard, locked in a cold that makes the ground itself seem hostile to human presence. The wind carries with it the smell of diesel fuel and engine oil. In the distance, very far away at first, you might hear something if you listened carefully enough. The distant rumble of engines. Not one, but many. Heavy engines, the deep mechanical breathing of diesel motors straining under tremendous weight. Tank engines, panzer engines. They are still miles away, moving slowly through the darkness and the cold, their headlights masked to avoid Soviet reconnaissance aircraft, their radio traffic kept to an absolute minimum. The roads here are barely roads at all, frozen mud tracks that wind between scattered villages and across empty fields. The vehicles move in columns, one after another, an endless procession of metal and machinery that has taken weeks to assemble. This is the moment before the last great gamble. Before Spring Awakening, the operation that the Germans called Unternehmen Frühlingserwachen, a final offensive launched not because anyone believed it could alter the course of the war, but because the alternative, to do nothing and watch the Soviet army roll westward unopposed, seemed somehow more unbearable. There is something almost dreamlike about the moment we are approaching, something that moves like a narrative already written, a story that everyone involved somehow understood would end in sorrow and loss. The Hungarian plain itself had become, by this point in the war, a kind of crossroads of the dying Reich. It was a place that mattered because of what lay beneath it, oil fields that Germany desperately needed, fuel depots that represented the last reserves of the Third Reich's industrial capacity. But it mattered also because it was still German-held territory, still nominally under German control, and that meant something to the men who were about to fight here. For the Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions moving through the frost and darkness, Hungary represented possibility, however thin. It represented ground that had not yet been surrendered to the enemy. The soldiers riding in the trucks, sitting in the turrets of tanks, standing in the frozen darkness waiting for dawn, were a curious mixture of men. Some of them were ideological true believers, men who had been shaped by Nazi ideology from adolescence and could imagine no other future. Others were conscripts, men who had been swept into the war machine by circumstance and compulsion. Many were veterans, scarred by years of fighting on the Eastern Front, their nerves worn thin, their bodies exhausted, their faith in ultimate victory already fractured. But all of them were professionals now, highly trained soldiers who understood armored warfare in ways that few soldiers in any army had ever understood it. They moved through the darkness with a kind of mechanical precision that was itself a kind of tragedy. The cold deepens as evening approaches. The wind picks up a little, not howling, but persistent, penetrating. It cuts through layers of wool and canvas and leather. The men wrap themselves tighter in their greatcoats. Some of them have already learned the grim mathematics of winter warfare on the Eastern Front. How many minutes the human body can endure in sub-zero temperatures before frostbite begins its slow, irreversible work. How sound travels differently in extreme cold. How machines begin to fail when the lubricant in their gears becomes sluggish and thick. How the metal of a gun barrel can burn the flesh it touches if you are careless enough to let skin contact the cold surface. In the distance, very faintly now, you can hear the grinding of tank treads on frozen ground. The sound is distinctive, a kind of clanking metallic rhythm that is unmistakable once you have heard it. It is not a sound of violence, not yet. It is a sound of movement, of machinery in motion, of weight and power being transported across space. Each tank weighs many tons. Each one requires tremendous fuel to move, and yet they are moving, slowly, inexorably, toward the Soviet lines. They are moving toward the moment when the frozen silence of the Hungarian plain will be shattered by the roar of engines and gunfire, by the sound of metal striking metal, by the screams of wounded men. But that moment has not yet arrived. For now, there is only the wind, and the cold, and the distant rumble of engines in the darkness. There is only the sense of history in motion, of events about to unfold that cannot be stopped or altered. There is only the strange, dreamlike quality of being present at a moment that you somehow already know will end in failure and sorrow. The frost glitters on the fields, the sky darkens, the wind continues its patient, indifferent work of moving across the frozen landscape. And in that darkness, thousands of men move toward their fates, carrying with them the weight of an ideology that is dying, the memory of victories that are fading, and the desperate, diminishing hope that perhaps, in this one final moment, something miraculous might still be possible. The year is 1945, and the map of Europe has become a landscape of contraction and desperation. By the time the frost settles across Hungary in those opening weeks of winter, the German Reich exists in a state of terminal compression. The vast territorial empire that had sprawled across the continent just months before, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Soviet interior, has begun its final, inexorable shrinkage. Armies that once pressed toward Moscow and the Caucasus now find themselves fighting on soil they had conquered years earlier, their supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of hostile territory, their reserves depleted by campaigns that bled men and machines into the ground. On the Eastern Front, the situation has become almost unimaginable. By January of that year, the Soviet winter offensive would shatter the German lines across a front that extended from the Baltic to the Carpathians. The Red Army, vastly outnumbering its opponents, armed with seemingly endless reserves of tanks and men, had grown into a force of almost mechanical inevitability. Warsaw fell. The Germans retreated through Poland. Soviet spearheads reached the Vistula, then pressed beyond it, driving toward the German borders themselves. The mythology of German invincibility, which had sustained the Reich through years of conquest, was evaporating like breath on that frozen plain. Consider for a moment what this meant for the men in command, for the generals and leaders who understood with terrible clarity that time itself had become the enemy. The war that was supposed to have ended in the summer of 1941 when German columns would allegedly capture Moscow before winter, had stretched into nearly 4 years of grinding attrition. The initial vision of Lebensraum, of quick victory and eternal empire, had transformed into a nightmare of endless warfare on multiple fronts, against enemies who refused to surrender, and reserves that seemed to replenish themselves no matter how many divisions were destroyed. Yet Hungary, in those final months, had become a place of strange strategic importance, almost a fever dream in the mind of Hitler and his remaining advisors. It was not a matter of grand conquest any longer. Rather, it was about survival, about holding one more territory that contained something Germany desperately needed. Deep beneath the Hungarian soil, near the town of Nagy Kanizsa in the southwest, lay oil fields. Modest by the standards of Middle Eastern production, yes, but to a Germany that had been cut off from its principal fuel supplies, hunted by Allied bombers, and strangled by naval blockades, these fields represented something close to salvation. Without fuel, tanks could not move. Without fuel, aircraft could not fly. Without fuel, the entire machinery of modern warfare simply ceased to function. Hungary was the last major source of petroleum that the Third Reich could still call its own. This was not abstract geopolitical maneuvering. This was desperation crystallized into strategic doctrine. If Hungary fell, if the Red Army swept into those oil-producing regions and brought them under Soviet control, the German war machine would grind to a complete halt. The Luftwaffe was already flying fewer missions, not because of lack of will or lack of aircraft, but because there was literally not enough fuel to keep the planes in the air. The Panzer Divisions, those legendary armored formations that had defined German military excellence, would become immobilized metal sculptures on abandoned battlefields. To hold Hungary was, in Hitler's increasingly fractured reasoning, to hold the last thread of possibility. And so, as the winter of 44 turned toward the spring of 45, a decision crystallized within the German High Command. Instead of consolidating defenses along the borders of the Reich itself, instead of building fortress positions to make the Soviet advance as costly as possible in the heartland of Germany, Hitler made a choice that would seem almost incomprehensible to many of his generals. He would gather the most elite formations still at his disposal, the Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions, the units that had been hardened in years of brutal combat, that were still considered to be the finest armored troops in the world, and he would launch them into Hungary. Not to secure a permanent peace, not to drive the Soviets back to Moscow, but simply to seize and hold the oil fields for a few more months, perhaps to arrange a negotiated settlement, perhaps simply because the alternative was too bleak to contemplate. This decision would set in motion one of the final great offensives of the Second World War in Europe. It would involve divisions whose names had become synonymous with both military excellence and profound evil: the Leibstandarte, the Das Reich, the Totenkopf, the Viking, the Hohenstaufen. These were not conscript armies of ordinary soldiers. These were elite formations, selected from among the most ideologically committed members of the Nazi state, trained to perfection, equipped with the finest weapons still available, led by officers who had survived multiple campaigns and understood the brutal calculus of modern armor warfare. If you find yourself drawn to this particular story, to the final desperate gamble of a dying regime, to the detailed movements and counter-movements of divisions locked in their ultimate struggle, to the quiet human dimensions of men facing the knowledge that their cause was lost but their orders were absolute, then consider subscribing to this channel. We explore these vast historical narratives with the precision they deserve, honoring both the complexity of the events and the very human reality of those who lived through them. For now, though, the trains are being readied. Across what remains of the German railway network, orders are being issued. Elite divisions are being withdrawn from sectors they have held for months. Their vehicles, their supplies, their men are being loaded onto flat cars and redirected south and east toward Hungary. The spring offensive, Operation Frühlingserwachen, the operation known as Spring Awakening, is being prepared in careful detail. And in the headquarters of the German High Command, in the bunkers where Hitler and his remaining advisors huddle, the maps are being marked, the coordinates calculated, the last great roll of the dice is being prepared. The winter landscape of Hungary held something far more precious than territory on a map. Beneath the frozen fields and around the shallow, reedy basins of the lakes lay fuel, crude oil, refined petrol, diesel oil, and synthetic fuels manufactured in sprawling complexes that had become as vital to the German war machine as blood to a failing heart. By 1945, as the Reich's borders shrank inward like a closing fist, Hungary represented perhaps the only remaining source of liquid fuel that Germany still controlled, and this fact alone had transformed a relatively peripheral theatre into something approaching desperation. The oil fields around Nagy Kanizsa in the southwest and the refineries scattered across the landscape had been feeding German tanks, trucks, and aircraft throughout the war. But as 1944 turned toward 1945, and as Soviet armies crashed westward with seemingly unstoppable momentum, the mathematics of German survival became brutally simple. The synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr were now under constant bombardment by the Allies. The Romanian oil fields, once a primary source, had fallen to Soviet capture in the autumn of 1944, cutting off what had been calculated as crucial reserves. Every refinery Germany could still reach was either heavily damaged or in imminent danger of capture. Hungary remained. The question was whether it could remain German long enough to matter. Consider the peculiar vulnerability of an industrial war economy stretched across an increasingly fractured continent. A panzer division required not just men and machines, but fuel, hundreds of thousands of liters daily to move through snow and mud, to power generators, to feed the massive appetite of engines designed for speed and conquest. A single Tiger tank consumed fuel at a rate that would seem almost obscene by modern standards. Trucks delivering ammunition and rations needed gasoline. The Luftwaffe, what remained of it, needed fuel for the handful of fighter sorties still deemed worth attempting. A retreat, paradoxically, requires even more fuel than an advance, more movement, more anxiety, more distance covered in desperation. Without the Hungarian oil fields, without Nagy Kanizsa and the refineries that processed crude into usable product, the German war machine would not simply slow, it would stall entirely. The geography made this worse, or perhaps clearer, depending on how one looks at it. Nagy Kanizsa lay in the southwestern portion of Hungary, relatively remote, requiring long supply lines to reach the front lines further east. The journey from refinery to tank was neither short nor simple, yet there existed no alternative, and alternatives in war are luxuries only winners can afford. The Germans had calculated early in 1945 that if Hungary remained in their possession, if these fields could keep producing even modest quantities, if the refineries could keep operating, then perhaps, just perhaps, they might sustain enough military mobility to negotiate from something approaching strength rather than absolute surrender. This is why Hitler had become increasingly fixated on Hungary. This is why he had begun moving elite divisions southward in the final winter of the war, divisions that might have been used to defend Berlin itself, divisions whose movements had to be carefully concealed from the Allies' aerial reconnaissance. The gamble was this: commit the remaining armoured reserves to one final massive offensive in Hungary, break through Soviet lines, secure the oil fields permanently, and perhaps restore enough military capacity to turn the tide. It was a gamble built on fading fuel and fading hope, but it was a gamble Hitler felt he had to make. The actual quantities involved were never enormous by the standards of earlier in the war. German intelligence estimates, which themselves were often optimistic in ways that reflected wishful thinking rather than reality, suggested the Hungarian fields and refineries could produce something in the range of 400,000 to 500,000 tons of oil annually at peak capacity. Even in early 1945, with sabotage, air raids, and deteriorating conditions, they were producing a fraction of that. Yet that fraction, those limited thousands of tons, represented the difference between an army that could move and an army that would be immobilized. The difference between a force that could launch an offensive, no matter how desperate, and a force reduced to static defense. There was also something almost paradoxical about this desperation. The Nazis had begun the war, in part, imagining conquest of Soviet territories with vast oil reserves. They had fought across thousands of kilometers seeking these resources, and now, 6 years later, they found themselves clinging to the oil fields of a reluctant ally, a country whose government they had essentially puppeteered, but which could not be fully trusted, surrounded by enemies. Hungary was like a final island, shrinking but still above water, and everything depended on holding it, or so the calculations seemed to suggest. What made the Hungarian oil situation particularly fragile was its dependence on an intact infrastructure. The fields themselves could not simply be relocated. The refineries could not be moved. The complex network of rail lines, pipelines, and transport routes that connected production to consumption was fixed in place and therefore vulnerable. Bombing could disrupt it. Soviet advances could capture it. Even the friction and chaos of military operations, a bridge destroyed here, a rail junction damaged there, could throttle the supply of fuel as effectively as direct capture. This was the nightmare that haunted German planners. Not a sudden, dramatic fall of the oil fields to enemy assault, but a slow, grinding degradation of the system's ability to function. And a grinding degradation was, in fact, precisely what was beginning to happen. The Soviet Union, watching German movements and listening to German signals, understood perfectly what Hungary meant in terms of fuel. Soviet strategic planners knew that if Germany could secure and fully exploit the Hungarian oil fields, the war might drag on months longer. If Germany could restore even partial access to substantial quantities of fuel, the Eastern Front might become frozen. The opportunities for decisive Soviet breakthroughs might be postponed. Therefore, from a Soviet perspective, Hungary was not simply another piece of conquered territory. It was a resource denial problem. The oil fields had to be taken or destroyed. This created a strange convergence of desperation on both sides. Germany was sending its last armoured reserves southward, in hopes of launching an offensive that might preserve access to fuel. The Soviet Union was preparing to annihilate those same armoured reserves and seize the fuel source for itself. Into this collision between failing hope and gathering strength, the winter of 1945 was drawing to a close. Spring was approaching. The frozen fields would thaw. The offensive that Hitler had ordered, the offensive that would become known as Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, was being prepared in secret, its elements moving into position through snow and darkness, its fuel needs calculated with precision, its success depending entirely on the logic of oil and conquest that had driven the war since its beginning. The Waffen-SS had not always been armoured formations. That transformation, from ideological bodyguard to mechanized elite, occurred slowly, then suddenly, across the span of a single decade that reshaped what warfare itself could mean. To understand the men who would roll across Hungarian mud in the winter of their Reich's closing chapter, we must drift backward into the peculiar origins of these divisions, their strange birth from something far smaller and far more sinister than any traditional military organization. In the beginning, the SS was Adolf Hitler's personal guard, Schutzstaffel, protection squad, A few hundred men in black uniforms, sworn to absolute loyalty not to Germany or to any constitutional order, but to one man alone. It was 1925 when Heinrich Himmler took command of this skeletal force, and he possessed an unusual ambition. He did not wish merely to guard Hitler's body. He wished to create an entirely separate military structure alongside the German army, the Wehrmacht, an armed force of true believers, ideologically pure, personally devoted, drawn from the racial and spiritual principles that the Nazi regime claimed as its foundation. It was, in its conception, an organization built not on law or tradition, but on loyalty and ideology. A shadow army with its own officer corps, its own rituals, its own internal mythology. By the late 1930s, this personal bodyguard had grown into a small but formidable force. The SS had formed motorized regiments. It had added artillery. It had acquired an identity separate from the Wehrmacht, a prestige that drew ambitious young men and older veterans who believed they were joining something sacred, something chosen. The standard Wehrmacht soldier took an oath to the German state. The SS man took an oath to Adolf Hitler. The distinction seemed insignificant to outsiders. To those inside, it was everything. When war came in 1939, the SS regiments fought alongside the Wehrmacht in Poland. They acquitted themselves with ferocity and efficiency, though accounts of their conduct, particularly towards civilian populations and prisoners, were already dark, already stained with the particular cruelty that would come to define their institution. But within the German military hierarchy, the SS remained somewhat apart, somewhat separate. A special force, a different breed. This identity grew stronger as the war progressed, and as casualties mounted among the Wehrmacht divisions, the SS regiments began to receive better equipment, more resources, greater prestige within the armed forces themselves. The transformation accelerated around 1941 and 1942. The SS established its first Panzer Divisions, armored formations equipped with tanks, assault guns, and the machinery of mechanized war. This was a deliberate choice by Himmler and by Hitler himself. They did not wish the SS to remain merely an infantry force, however elite. They wished to create an armored strike force that would answer only to them, that would embody the very cutting edge of German technological and martial prowess. And so the Waffen-SS, as this armed branch came to be called, distinguishing it from the administrative and police SS, began to field panzer divisions whose names would become legendary in German military history. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the Das Reich Division. These were not accidents of nomenclature, they were declarations of purpose. They belonged to a different order entirely. What gave these divisions their particular character, beyond the obvious ideological fervor that motivated their recruits, was something subtler and more complex. The Waffen-SS, by design, trained longer than Wehrmacht divisions. Officers received more instruction. Tank crews trained for months longer than their Wehrmacht counterparts. The divisions were rotated to quieter fronts more often, allowing for rest and retraining that Wehrmacht units could rarely afford. This meant that by 1943 and 1944, the SS Panzer Divisions possessed a level of competence and cohesion that often exceeded even the best Wehrmacht formations. They were, in many measurable ways, better soldiers, more professional, more dangerous. Yet there was a paradox embedded within this excellence. The very ideology that gave them unity and motivation, the racial mysticism, the personal loyalty to Hitler, the belief that they were the elite of a racially chosen people, also created a kind of brittleness. Wehrmacht commanders, inheritors of Prussian military traditions stretching back centuries, possessed a certain flexibility of thought, an ability to adapt and sometimes to question orders. The SS officer, bound by absolute ideology and absolute obedience, could not afford such flexibility. His identity was wrapped up entirely in the system he served. Questioning the system meant questioning himself. As the war turned inexorably against Germany, these differences became more pronounced. The Wehrmacht, particularly its officer corps, began quietly to retreat into a kind of professional distance from Nazi ideology. The Waffen-SS, by contrast, seemed only to grip more tightly to the doctrines that had formed it. And as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated, as the Soviets pressed from the east and the Americans and British from the west, these elite SS Panzer Divisions found themselves thrown into one desperate defensive battle after another. They fought with extraordinary tactical skill. Their tank crews were veterans. Their officers, for the most part, were imaginative and bold. Yet even excellence cannot overcome the mathematics of strategic collapse. By the time these divisions arrived in Hungary in late 1944 and early 1945, they had already been broken and reformed multiple times. The Leibstandarte had fought in Poland, France, the Soviet Union, Italy, the Ardennes. The Das Reich Division had endured the grinding horror of the Eastern Front. The Totenkopf had been encircled more than once, had suffered casualties that would have destroyed lesser formations, had bounced back again and again. The men who drove the tanks, who crewed the assault guns, who carried rifles through winter forests, these were no longer ideological fanatics fresh from the training grounds. Many were teenagers, conscripted into a hopeless cause. Many were survivors, hardened and weary, hanging on to nothing more than the bond they shared with their comrades and a kind of numb professionalism that transcended ideology. Yet the divisions themselves retained their mystique. Their names still meant something in German military circles. Their reputation still preceded them. And Hitler, still, impossibly, still directing grand strategy from his bunker, still believed in them, still thought that the elite SS Panzer Divisions could somehow perform miracles, could reverse the tide, could shock the world one final time with their prowess. It was this faith, misplaced, desperate, ultimately tragic, that would draw these formations toward Hungary, toward one last great offensive, toward the frozen fields and mud-choked rivers where their legend would finally and irrevocably fade into history. The divisions that would converge on Hungary in the waning months of the war were not conscript formations hastily assembled from civilian drafts. They were the remnants of an experiment in ideological warfare, institutions that had evolved over more than a decade into something singular in the modern military world, armored forces bound not merely by tactics and discipline, but by a shared mythology, a culture cultivated from their foundation as the personal guard of the Reich's political leadership. To understand what they brought to Hungary, one must know who they were, where they had been, and what they had become through years of unimaginable violence across the European continent. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the oldest and perhaps most symbolically important of these formations, began as something almost quaint by the standards of what it would become, a small SS honor guard unit formed in the early 1930s, hand-picked bodyguards for the Nazi leadership. From those modest origins as a ceremonial unit, it transformed gradually into a combat formation, seeing action in Poland, France, the Balkans, and across the vast killing grounds of the Soviet Union. By the time it arrived in Hungary, the Leibstandarte existed as a shadow of its former strength in terms of numbers, though not in reputation or the intensity of its remaining personnel. Its survivors were veteran soldiers, hardened through nearly a decade of continuous warfare, men who had fought across frontiers and learned an armor doctrine born from desperate necessity rather than any formal military tradition. The unit carried within it a kind of institutional memory of the Reich itself, a sense that it represented something sacred to the Nazi state, and this belief, whether conscious or absorbed through years of indoctrination, gave it a psychological character distinct from ordinary Wehrmacht formations. Das Reich Division, formerly the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, carried a different but equally heavy history. It too had roots in the pre-war SS, but by 1945 it was a veteran armoured force that had fought from the Atlantic to the steppes of Russia. Its path to Hungary was a journey measured in bloodshed, France, where it participated in brutal anti-partisan operations, the Eastern Front, where it endured some of the most savage battles of the entire war, and the recent catastrophe of the Ardennes offensive, where it had been committed to Hitler's last great Western gamble. The men of Das Reich who arrived in Hungary were exhausted in a way that is difficult for those who have not lived through such campaigns to truly comprehend. They had experienced the slow realization that the war they had believed winnable was slipping away, that each offensive brought fewer gains and larger losses, and that the momentum they had once possessed had reversed completely. Yet they came to Hungary because they were ordered to come, and because within the SS culture, orders were not suggestions to be questioned, but obligations absolute. The Hohenstaufen Division, the 9th SS Panzer Corps, represented a somewhat different profile. Though younger as a unit than either Leibstandarte or Das Reich, having been formally raised in 1943, it had earned a fierce reputation in some of the most difficult fighting of the Eastern Front, particularly in operations around Kharkov and in the desperate battles in the Ukraine. The Hohenstaufen arrived in Hungary, carrying the weight of having recently been trapped in the Falaise pocket during the Normandy campaign, an encirclement in which the division had suffered catastrophic losses even as it fought with the same determined ferocity that characterized SS combat doctrine. Reconstituted in the months after that disaster, the Hohenstaufen represented a division still in the process of rebuilding its core strength when the call came to move to Hungary. Its soldiers were a mixture of hardened survivors from earlier campaigns and younger men brought in to fill the terrible gaps left by casualties, a duality that would shape its performance in the coming offensive. The Viking Division, the 5th SS Panzer Corps, carried within it a kind of international character unique among the SS formations. It had been recruited in significant measure from non-German Nordic volunteers, Scandinavians, Belgians, and others who had answered the ideological call of the SS and enlisted for what they believed was a continental struggle against Bolshevism. The Viking Division had fought extensively in the East, in the Baltic campaigns, and had suffered enormous losses in the collapse of German positions in the Ukraine and the subsequent retreat toward the Reich. By early 1945, the Viking represented a division fighting partly for ideology perhaps, but more immediately for survival, for the knowledge that defeat meant not honorable surrender, but the possibility of retribution from enemies who viewed SS volunteers with particular animosity. The Scandinavian and other non-German volunteers who remained in the Vikings' ranks faced an uncertain future unlike that of their German comrades, and this knowledge, subtle though it might remain unspoken, coloured the desperation with which they fought. The Totenkopf Division, the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, carried a name and a history that would haunt it throughout the post-war years. The death's head insignia from which it drew its name had origins in the concentration camp guards of the pre-war SS, a grim heritage that could never fully be escaped. The Totenkopf, as a combat division, had proven itself effective on the Eastern Front, had fought with the ferocity characteristic of SS units, and had suffered losses proportionate to its intensity. It arrived in Hungary bearing the accumulated trauma of years of combat in Russia, the knowledge among its officers and men that the war had become not merely a military struggle, but a fight for survival against enemies who, they believed, and with some justification feared, would show them little mercy if captured. The Totenkopf represented perhaps the starkest example of how ideological formations, once committed to combat, became instruments of warfare indistinguishable in many tactical respects from regular military units, though the culture, the mythology, and the psychology of their personnel remained distinct. These 5 divisions, arriving in Hungary from various directions and at slightly different times as the early winter months of 1945 unfolded, represented the last concentrated deployment of elite German armoured forces. Together they numbered, in terms of combat-effective tanks and vehicles, perhaps something in the range of 400 to 500 tanks, along with supporting infantry, engineers, and artillery, a formidable force by the standards of what Germany could still muster, yet insufficient for what the strategic situation now demanded. Their soldiers were largely experienced in combat, hardened by years of warfare, and in many cases thoroughly indoctrinated in the ideology that the SS represented, though as the war drew toward its inevitable conclusion, the belief in ultimate victory had begun to give way to a grimmer determination simply to fight until ordered to stop, or until circumstances removed the possibility of further fighting. As the autumn of 1944 deepened across Central Europe, the city of Budapest was beginning to understand, with a creeping dread that settled into its streets like frost, that it would not remain a prize left undisturbed. The German occupation had held the Hungarian capital in an awkward grip for months, a city nominally allied with the Third Reich, yet increasingly aware that the tide of war was flowing backward, draining eastward into the Soviet abyss. By late October, the Red Army's advance had become something no longer distant or theoretical. It was a palpable, approaching presence whose guns could be heard on clear mornings from the higher districts of Pest, a low grumbling that made civilians pause and glance toward the eastern sky. The outer ring of Budapest defences, hastily fortified through the summer and early autumn, began to crumble with a speed that surprised even those who had been preparing for this eventuality. The German and Hungarian garrisons holding the outermost suburbs and villages, towns with names that meant little to the wider world, but everything to the families who lived within them, found themselves suddenly overmatched as Soviet mechanized columns swept around the city's perimeter in wide, encircling arcs. One might imagine the experience of a young Hungarian infantryman, perhaps conscripted only months before, watching from a hastily dug position as armor and trucks materialized through the autumn haze, and realizing in that moment that he was not defending his city so much as being trapped within a closing circle whose circumference grew tighter each day. The encirclement was not accomplished in a single dramatic thrust. Rather, it unfolded with a terrible inevitability across the first weeks of November, as Soviet forces pushed from the east and north, methodically reducing German-held positions and linking their spearheads to complete the ring. By the 8th of November, Budapest was effectively surrounded. Not yet a complete stranglehold, but close enough that the possibility of escape by road was evaporating. The Germans and their Hungarian allies, or what remained of them, for the political situation in Hungary had become a Byzantine tangle of competing loyalties and coercions, faced the prospect of a siege that could last weeks, perhaps months. Inside the city, the human landscape began to transform. Those who had resources and connections started to contemplate escape, though the windows for departure were closing rapidly. Others, soldiers, officials, ordinary civilians with nowhere to go and no clear understanding of what Soviet occupation might mean, settled into a strange state of suspended anticipation. The streets of Budapest, once elegant and graceful in the Austrian manner, began to take on the appearance of a city preparing for something it could not quite imagine. Barricades appeared in certain quarters. Anti-tank obstacles were positioned on bridges. Windows were boarded or taped against the blast of artillery. The psychological effect of encirclement on a civilian population cannot be overstated, even after the passage of 8 decades. Imagine being a mother in a Budapest apartment, knowing that your city is now cut off, that supplies will inevitably dwindle, that every day brings the sound of warfare closer, not as a distant phenomenon on some front far away, but as something that will soon, in the coming weeks, be at your doorstep, in your streets, perhaps even in your building. The knowledge that one is trapped is qualitatively different from the knowledge that danger exists. Entrapment creates a kind of psychological claustrophobia that extends beyond the physical to something deeper, more existential. The Wehrmacht and SS garrisons understood their predicament with stark clarity. They had orders from German high command that were categorical and without ambiguity. Budapest was to be held, not negotiated about, not gradually abandoned in an orderly withdrawal, but held. Hitler himself took a personal interest in Budapest's defense, viewing the city through the distorting lens of his ideology and his desperate need to believe that German power could still reverse its fortunes. The presence of SS Panzer Divisions in Hungary, though they had not yet arrived in large numbers by early November, seemed to promise that relief might come, that the encirclement might be broken from outside while the defenders held fast within. But those defenders, the mix of Wehrmacht regular soldiers, Hungarian troops of varying degrees of willingness and competence, SS units already stationed in the city, and various paramilitary formations, faced an impossible task. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly running short of ammunition as Soviet forces drew tighter and the supply routes were severed entirely. The outer rings of the city fell back toward the center, compressing the German-held territory into an ever-shrinking perimeter. Each street fought for, each block surrendered or held by desperate counterattacks, contributed to a mounting human toll that would grow, as the weeks passed, into something approaching the catastrophic. What happened next, through the remainder of November and into December, was a kind of attritional horror whose particular character, the combination of urban combat, Soviet military pressure, the chaos of mixed civilian and military populations, and the knowledge that one was trapped, created a very particular kind of suffering. The outer suburbs and industrial areas on the eastern bank of the Danube, Pest, fell progressively into Soviet hands. The Germans and their allies contracted toward the western bank, toward Buda, with its hills and its more defensible terrain, though defensible is a relative term when one is surrounded on all sides. The Soviet approach to urban warfare in 1944 and 45, it must be said, was characterized by a methodical application of overwhelming firepower. Artillery barrages preceded each advance, reducing buildings and fortifications to rubble. Soviet infantry then moved through the desolation, clearing room by room. This was warfare stripped of all pretense of elegance or strategy in the grand sense. It was simply the application of superior force against entrenched defenders, repeated with monotonous inevitability until the defenders were overwhelmed, or fled, or died. Inside Budapest, during those autumn weeks turning toward winter, the human cost of the encirclement became increasingly visible. Civilians found themselves caught in the fighting, unable to easily flee, unable to remain safely in their homes. Buildings were damaged and destroyed. Supply lines for the civilian population were disrupted or cut entirely. By early December, the city was beginning to experience the deprivations that would characterize the full siege in the months to come. Food shortages, water difficulties, the cold of approaching winter without adequate fuel or shelter, and the constant presence of violence that could erupt at almost any moment and any location. One might reflect, in the quietness before sleep, on how a city like Budapest, a place with centuries of history, with culture and commerce and the ordinary lives of hundreds of thousands of people, could find itself so rapidly transformed from a functioning capital into a besieged fortress, compressed and desperate. The mechanisms by which this happened were partly military, partly political, partly driven by the vast impersonal forces of war, and partly the result of decisions made by distant leaders in bunkers and command posts who viewed the suffering of an entire city as an acceptable price for their strategic aims. The early phases of the encirclement and siege, from November through early December, thus served as a kind of grimly educational introduction to what the coming months would bring, a preview of the comprehensive destruction and human suffering that a siege, conducted without mercy or restraint, would entail. The outer defences had fallen or been abandoned. The ring was closing, and inside, hundreds of thousands of people, soldiers and civilians both, were beginning the long nightmare of waiting, fighting, and enduring in a city that would soon become, for a brief period in the early months of 1945, one of the theatres of the most intense urban warfare in all of human history. And so the question that began to haunt German military planners in late 1944 was simple in its desperation. Could the encircled garrison of Budapest be reached? Could it be relieved before starvation, cold, and Soviet artillery dissolved an entire army group into ash and memory? The outer defences of the city had collapsed by the first week of January 1945. Soviet forces had closed a massive encirclement around the Danube's winding path through the Hungarian plain, trapping some 180,000 German and Hungarian troops in the rubble of what had once been the jewel of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The soldiers inside that shrinking perimeter could hear the guns growing closer each day. They could see the smoke rising from their own supply depots. They were running out of food, out of ammunition, out of time. And yet, there was still hope. Desperate, fragile hope. Because in the winter stillness of the Hungarian countryside, German armour was gathering. SS Panzer Divisions that had fought at every burning crossroads from France to the Carpathians were being reassembled here, their tanks brought forward on rail transports through the snow, their crews rotating back from exhaustion into the cold clarity of a final mission. Surely, those men told themselves, surely they could punch through the Soviet lines. Surely they could drive a corridor into Budapest and hold it open long enough to save what remained of the garrison. This was the thinking that led to Operation Conrad, or rather, to the first of 3 successive operations, each one bearing that name, each one descending deeper into futility and heartbreak as the weeks passed. Conrad I began in the first days of January 1945, almost immediately after the encirclement closed. The German plan was elegant in its desperation: strike southeastward from the area around Lake Balaton, penetrate the Soviet lines, and open a supply route into Budapest from the west. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, still elite despite its long battles, was committed to the assault. So too were elements of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, fresh divisions ordered south from Austrian and German territories, soldiers who had rarely seen combat, but who carried the weight of their SS training, their ideological conditioning, their knowledge that they were the Reich's last blade. The offensive opened with the familiar grinding roar of tank engines starting in the pre-dawn cold. Picture it, if you will, crews pulling themselves up into the turrets and drivers' compartments, breath frosting in the dark, officers consulting maps by the light of shielded lamps, radio operators checking frequencies, the slow, grinding movement of an entire mechanized corps, preparing to move toward an enemy they could not yet see but could hear in the distance, the ever-present rumble of Soviet armor, the murmur of Soviet guns. And initially, remarkably, the Germans advanced. The first breakthrough was real. For a few days, the armor pushed through the snow-covered farmland, crushed Soviet positions, took prisoners, seized ground. In Budapest, the trapped garrison heard the sound of their approaching countrymen. Hope bloomed in the besieged city like a fragile winter flower. Perhaps, after all, they would be saved. Perhaps the Reich still had strength enough for one final miracle. But miracles, as any soldier who has truly lived through war knows, are rare commodities. The Soviet command understood instantly what was happening. Marshal Tolbukhin, who commanded Soviet forces in this sector, simply shifted his reserves, concentrated artillery, and began to pour reinforcements into the breach. And gradually, inexorably, the German advance slowed. The fighting became a grinding, attritional nightmare. Panzer crews who had fought across Europe found themselves tangled in a landscape that seemed designed to work against them. Snow that churned into mud, terrain that offered no cover. Soviet anti-tank guns dug in with methodical persistence at every ridgeline and village. The German divisions advanced not in spectacular breakthroughs but in small, bitter increments. A few kilometers one day, a village captured after hours of close-quarters fighting, then a counterattack that pressed them back almost as far as they had come. By mid-January, Conrad I had stalled. The Germans had pushed forward perhaps 40 kilometers from their starting point, but they were still 30 or more kilometers short of Budapest, and the cost, already heavy, was beginning to weigh on the morale of the attacking forces. Tank losses mounted steadily. Infantry companies that had begun the offensive with 90 men found themselves down to 30 or 40 by the campaign's second week. Supply lines stretched and became vulnerable. And still, the Soviet lines held, reformed, and pressed back. What is striking, listening to accounts from those who were there, is how quickly the certainty of the first few days gave way to a kind of exhausted resignation. The officers and NCOs who had survived years of total war knew the signs. They could read the mathematics of attrition, the way the enemy always seemed to have more men, more guns, more reserves. They could feel the moment when an offensive transitions from a genuine operation with a realistic chance of success into something else. A desperate throwing of bodies and machines into a grinding millstone. By the last week of January, German High Command made the difficult decision to call off Conrad I. The offensive had not broken through. The garrison of Budapest remained encircled, and the panzer divisions that had been committed to the attempt were now battered, low on fuel and ammunition, and positioned too far forward to easily consolidate a defensive line. But to call it off entirely was unthinkable. Hitler would not hear of it. And so, after only a few days of regrouping, the orders came down for a second attempt. Conrad II. This time, the plan was similar but adjusted. The attack would come from a different direction, aimed at opening a passage from the southwest rather than the west. The divisions that had fought in the first operation were joined by fresh units pulled from other sectors, and the German planners dared to hope that new blood, new armor, fresh energy might accomplish what fatigue and Soviet resistance had prevented the first time. Conrad II opened in early February, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed that the lessons of the first offensive might be applied successfully. German armor broke through Soviet positions again, ground was taken, villages fell. Once more, hope flickered in the besieged city. Once more, German commanders began to believe that perhaps, after all, salvation was possible. But the Soviet response was swift and merciless. If anything, their defenses were stronger this time, positioned more deliberately, and the Germans, exhausted from the previous operation, low on fuel, operating at the very end of their logistical reach, could not sustain the attack. By the middle of February, Conrad II had also stalled, having penetrated the Soviet lines perhaps as far as the first attempt, but achieving no breakthrough, opening no corridor, saving no one. The trapped garrison in Budapest, which had heard the sound of approaching German armor twice now, heard it fade away twice. Despair began to take root. The city's defenders, many of them Hungarian troops fighting alongside German soldiers, increasingly convinced that Berlin had abandoned them to their fate, began to understand a terrible truth. Relief was not coming, or at the very least, relief might not come in time. And yet the orders for a third attempt came anyway. Conrad III. Would it be the final roll of the dice, the last gamble, or was it simply an extension of a tragedy that everyone, from Hitler in his bunker to the tank commanders in the snow, had already come to understand as inevitable? The third offensive began in mid-February. The Germans had few reserves left. The divisions committed to the previous attempts were worn down to perhaps 60 or 70% of their theoretical strength. Fuel was rationed more strictly than ever. The men who climbed into their tanks knew, with a clarity that comes only from repeated failure, that this was likely their last chance. And they also understood, with equal clarity, that it probably would not be enough. This time, the Soviet defences held almost immediately. German armour found itself blocked, bogged down in terrain that seemed almost malevolent in its resistance. The advance, which had measured itself in kilometres in the previous operations, now measured itself in 100-metre increments. Villages that should have fallen in hours took entire days to capture, and all the while, Soviet artillery, seemingly infinite, seemingly inexhaustible, poured fire onto German positions. By late February, Conrad III collapsed. The last relief attempt had failed, and with it went something more than military hope. In the eyes of the soldiers still trapped in Budapest, still holding positions in the rubble of the Hungarian capital, a kind of spiritual hope died as well. They were, finally and absolutely, on their own. The human cost of these three operations, these three successive waves of hope and disappointment, was staggering. German casualties in the Conrad operations exceeded 40,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Soviet losses were comparable, though the Red Army, with its vastly superior manpower reserves, could afford them more easily. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed or crippled. Entire companies and battalions were reduced to platoon strength. Experienced NCOs, the backbone of any army, were simply gone, their knowledge and expertise lost in the snow and mud of the Hungarian plain. And yet, from a strategic perspective, the Conrad operations had achieved something else. Something that the exhausted soldiers fighting them may not have fully recognized even as they were experiencing it. They had consumed time, resources, and the last reserves of German combat power at a moment when those resources might have been used elsewhere. Every panzer that was destroyed trying to break through to Budapest was a panzer that would not be available for the defense of the Reich itself. Every experienced SS soldier who fell in the failed relief attempts was one who would not be standing in the streets of Berlin or Vienna or Munich in the days to come. In this way, the tragedy of the Conrad operations, the grinding, exhausting, ultimately futile attempts to rescue the encircled garrison, was part of a larger tragedy unfolding across the wreckage of German power. They represented not the last gasp of an emerging strategy, but the final, desperate expenditure of a military force in its death throes, throwing what remained of its strength at problems that could no longer be solved through the application of courage and armor alone. The soldiers who survived these operations, battered and depleted, would retreat westward through the Hungarian winter. The garrison in Budapest would face a far grimmer reckoning. And in Berlin, in his bunker, Hitler would already be turning his attention to his next and final gamble, one that would consume the last irreplaceable reserves of the SS Panzer Divisions in a new and even more desperate offensive, far to the southward. By the second week of February, the ring around Budapest had begun to tighten in ways that no relief column could any longer hope to break. The outer defences had fallen. The districts closest to the encircling Soviet lines had been surrendered, block by smoking block, and what remained was a core city collapsing inward on itself, growing more compressed, more desperate, more fatal with each passing day. The Germans and Hungarians still fighting inside the city limits, some 30 to 40,000 soldiers by the most generous estimates, though the numbers were already becoming unclear in the chaos, found themselves in a position of pure geometric suffocation. artillery fire fell almost constantly. The Danube, which bisects Budapest, had become less a line of communication than a barrier that now trapped defenders on both banks, unable to fully coordinate, separated by water that had turned into a killing ground where any crossing attempt was met with immediate Soviet fire from positions that had been fortified for weeks. The Soviets under General Malinovsky had time, they had ammunition, they had overwhelming numbers. They could afford to wait, or they could afford to attack. Either way, the outcome had long since been determined, though the soldiers still in the cellars and rubble heaps did not yet fully accept it. What happened in those final days of the city's defense exists now in fragments, in accounts written much later by men trying to reconstruct memory from trauma. The streets were impassable in many places, blocked by rubble and frozen corpses, and the smoking wrecks of armored vehicles. Food had become almost mythical, bread rations measured in grams if they came at all. Water could be obtained only by melting snow or ice, or by running across open ground to reach wells, which meant running through sniper fire. The hospitals overflowed with wounded, who lay on floors without anesthetic, sometimes for days, waiting for surgery that might never come because the surgeons themselves were sleeping in shifts of 2 hours, hands trembling from hunger and exhaustion. The Waffen-SS units, still holding portions of the perimeter, fought with the stubborn efficiency that had become their hallmark. But efficiency requires supplies, reinforcement, rotation of troops. None of these things were available. Men who had been fighting continuously for weeks without relief held positions because to abandon them meant the collapse of the entire defense line, and so they remained, watching the Russians creep closer through the ruins, knowing that surrender to Soviet forces meant, for SS men, something far worse than mere imprisonment. That knowledge alone kept many of them fighting. Yet there existed also, in those final days, another possibility. Some commanders and soldiers inside Budapest had begun to contemplate a breakout, not a relief effort arriving from outside, but an attempt by those trapped within to fight their way westward toward Austria, where German forces still held territory and where there might yet be a chance of survival, or at least of fighting one's way toward Western Allied lines. The possibility was discussed in hushed conversations in headquarters dugouts, the logistics sketched on maps. Theoretically, if a concentrated force could be assembled, if it could coordinate its movement toward a single breakthrough point in the Soviet line, if it could move quickly enough and fight hard enough, it might penetrate the encirclement. The odds of success were negligible. Everyone knew this. But the alternative was to wait in the rubble until the Soviets decided to end the siege by assault, which would mean room-to-room fighting, which would mean the complete destruction of what remained of the city and the complete destruction of those still fighting in it. On February 11th, as the darkness deepened and the temperature began to drop again toward the bitter cold that had characterized the early months of the year, the breakout attempt was ordered. Between 6,000 and 7,000 soldiers gathered in the ruins of the city, mostly concentrated in the western districts, and prepared to move. They carried with them what armored vehicles remained, a handful of tanks, some self-propelled guns, a few armored cars. They carried whatever ammunition they had left. Some carried wounded on stretchers, some carried the colors of their regiments, unwilling to leave these symbols behind. The breakout began in the darkness. What unfolded in the hours that followed was not really a breakout so much as it was an escape attempt, a desperate dash through the night toward the western suburbs and the hope of punching through the Soviet encirclement before dawn light made them vulnerable to aircraft and to coordinated fire from massed Soviet artillery. The men moved quietly at first, then with increasing speed and then with increasing violence as they made contact with Soviet positions. The fighting in those first hours was extraordinarily bitter. The Soviets were ready for an attempt such as this. They had expected it, had prepared for it, had positioned reserves to meet it, but the German and Hungarian soldiers who broke out of the city centre that night fought with an almost feral determination. This was not now about holding territory. This was about survival. This was about whether a man would see another day, or whether he would be killed here, in these frozen Hungarian streets. That clarity of purpose, that reduction of all of war to its absolute essence, produced moments of extraordinary ferocity. Some groups broke through, in the chaos of night fighting, in the darkness and confusion and noise of battle. A few elements of the breakout force managed to push through the Soviet lines, managed to reach the outskirts of the city, managed to escape into the countryside beyond. These survivors, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 of them, scattered into the frozen darkness, moving westward in small groups, avoiding roads, avoiding Soviet patrols, heading toward the lines of German forces that still held positions northwest of Budapest. Some would reach those lines, some would be captured in the days that followed. Some would die in the forest and the snow, but most did not break through. Most of the breakout force was encircled again within a few kilometers of the city. By the dawn light, the Soviets could see them clearly. Artillery fire fell on the scattered, exhausted columns. Tank formations moved in to contain them. Some groups fought their way into nearby villages and held them for hours or days, delaying the inevitable. Some simply surrendered when it became clear that further resistance was hopeless. The human cost of that night was immense. Estimates of the dead range from 1,500 to 3,500, but the true number is unknowable. What is clear is that the breakout attempt was, militarily, a catastrophe. Strategically, it was inevitable. Those soldiers who were captured in the days after the breakout joined the stream of prisoners flowing eastward towards Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. For the SS men among them, for those who had worn the double lightning bolts on their collar, the fate that awaited was particularly grim. Soviet hatred for the Waffen-SS was profound and, from a certain perspective, historically justified. The SS had committed atrocities in Soviet territory. The Soviets did not forget this. They did not forgive it. For captured SS personnel, survival rates in Soviet captivity were among the lowest of any combatant nationality. Many would not return from the camps until years after the war ended, if they returned at all. By mid-February, Budapest as a coordinated German-Hungarian defensive position ceased to exist. The city became instead a collection of isolated pockets, some no larger than a few blocks, each one holding out a little longer, each one receiving no supplies, no reinforcement, no hope of relief. The Soviet forces methodically reduced these pockets one by one. What had been a great city was being methodically destroyed, building by building, street by street. The civilian population trapped within, perhaps 250,000 people, though no one was counting with any accuracy, endured bombardment, starvation, and the chaos of urban warfare in frozen winter. And somewhere in the command posts of the German High Command, in the bunkers and headquarters still far from this frozen, ruined city, the leadership was already making other calculations. If Budapest could not be relieved, if Budapest was lost, then what purpose did it serve to send further forces to Hungary? What hope remained for a military victory in the east? And yet, at precisely this moment, Hitler was ordering the concentration of some of the last elite forces in the German arsenal, the SS Panzer Divisions themselves, to be moved to Hungary for one final, desperate effort to turn the tide. The reasoning behind this decision would occupy the thoughts of historians for decades to come. It was, perhaps, a last act of defiance, a refusal to accept inevitable defeat. Or perhaps it was simply the fantasy of a leader who had lost touch with reality, ordering armies that no longer existed to fight battles that could not be won. As the winter of 1945 deepened, and Budapest's rubble still smouldered in the streets, Adolf Hitler sat in his underground compound, the Führerbunker beneath Berlin, and made a decision that would perplex military historians for generations. Instead of committing his last remaining reserves of armor and elite troops to the defense of his capital city, the seat of Nazi power itself, he ordered that same fearsome strength be concentrated in Hungary, in a landscape of frozen fields and contested villages most Germans had barely heard of. It was, on the surface, a puzzling choice, one that suggests something deeper about how he saw the war's remaining possibilities, or perhaps how he had come to misread reality itself. To understand this decision, we must sit for a moment with the arithmetic of desperation. By early 1945, the Soviet armies pressing westward had become, in sheer numerical terms, nearly unstoppable. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front over the preceding months. Berlin itself, the symbolic heart of the Third Reich, lay within striking distance of enemy forces. Logically, a commander in the final stages of a war would pour his last strengths into defending the capital. Yet Hitler, who had long ceased to think in purely logical military terms, saw something else in the Hungarian plains. The oil fields around Nagy-Kanizsa and the broader petroleum resources of Hungary represented, in his mind, the last genuine lever for prolonging the war. Without fuel, the German war machine would simply stop. Tanks would become statuary. Aircraft would remain grounded. The entire apparatus of mechanized warfare would grind to silence. The Soviet advance, too, depended on supplies and logistics, and Hitler had convinced himself, or wished desperately to believe, that one final, audacious armored blow, delivered with maximum force at precisely the right moment, might shock the Soviets into pause, might disrupt their timetable, might create space for negotiation, or at minimum extend the conflict long enough for some miracle to materialize. There is, in retrospect, a quality of magical thinking to this reasoning. The reinforcement of Berlin would have been, militarily speaking, a more defensible strategy. But Hitler had become increasingly detached from the constraints of conventional military logic. He had always possessed an almost romantic faith in the possibility of the audacious gamble, the lightning stroke that would upset the enemy's carefully laid plans. In his earlier years, when Germany had possessed actual military superiority in specific theaters, this instinct had occasionally worked. Now, with Germany's overall position collapsing, that same instinct led him to commit his finest remaining divisions not to the defense of his own seat of power, but to a desperate last offensive in a foreign land. We might also consider, and this is necessarily speculation, for we cannot read the minds of the dead, that Hitler may have harbored a deeper psychological resistance to the idea of fighting for Berlin itself. To defend Berlin meant acknowledging, viscerally and inescapably, that the enemy was at the gates of the homeland. It meant accepting the defensive posture that he had always associated with weakness. An offensive operation, by contrast, even a desperate one, preserved the illusion of German initiative, of Germany still capable of striking rather than merely absorbing blows. The psychological comfort of aggression, even futile aggression, may have carried weight in his calculations. There was also a question of distance and communication. From Berlin, Hitler could not directly control the operations in Hungary, as he micromanaged so much of the conduct of the war. At the Führerbunker, isolated and increasingly out of touch with battlefield realities, he could issue grand strategic directives about an offensive in Hungary. He could imagine it succeeding because he was not present to witness the moment-by-moment difficulties, the mud, the exhaustion, the stubborn resistance of Soviet defenders. Berlin, by contrast, was present. Every sound of artillery, every report of Soviet positions drawing closer, was a constant reminder of deteriorating reality. Perhaps, one might gently suggest, the distant abstraction of Hungary was psychologically preferable to the immediate, undeniable reality pressing in on the capital itself. The decision also reflected the balance of power within the Nazi leadership at this late hour. The SS, and particularly the elite panzer divisions of the Waffen-SS, had become Hitler's favored instrument of war. Heinrich Himmler and his subordinates exercised significant influence over strategic decisions. The SS leadership had consistently argued that their elite formations possessed a special capability, a willingness and an ability that the regular Wehrmacht lacked. To commit these divisions in Hungary, rather than scatter them in the defense of Berlin or deploy them to other threatened sectors, was in some ways a validation of the SS's own claims about their indispensability. It was a final, grand gesture of faith in the organization that Hitler himself had helped build from the nothing of a small protective squad into a military force of hundreds of thousands. There may also have been a territorial reasoning at work, one rooted in historical memory and Nazi ideology. Hungary occupied a peculiar place in German strategic thinking. It had been a long-time ally, though increasingly a reluctant one, and it contained not merely the oil fields but also extensive agricultural resources and industrial capacity. If these territories could be secured, consolidated, and held, they might form the nucleus of a reduced but defensible German-dominated sphere. A successful operation in Hungary might, in this logic, preserve these resources within German hands rather than allowing them to fall to the Soviets. This was probably a fantasy, but it was the kind of fantasy that could seem appealing to a leadership increasingly divorced from reality. The decision to reinforce Hungary rather than Berlin also suggests that even at this late stage, Hitler had not entirely given up on the possibility of negotiated settlement. If Germany could demonstrate that it still possessed military strength, that it could still mount credible offensive operations, then perhaps the Western Allies might be induced to make separate peace. Perhaps the Soviets might be brought to the negotiating table if German forces could inflict sufficient damage and disrupt their strategic plans. This too was wishful thinking, but the desperate often wish. What we can say with certainty is that the choice revealed the extent to which Hitler's strategic vision had become detached from military reality. The divisions sent to Hungary were indeed elite, indeed capable, indeed equipped with some of the finest tanks and weapons Germany could produce. But they were also the last reserves. Once committed to Hungary, and exhausted in an offensive that would prove unable to achieve its objectives, they would be gone, and then nothing, truly nothing, would stand between the Soviet armies and the heart of Germany itself. In the winter of 1944, as snow deepened across the Ardennes and Hitler's last great gamble in the West had begun to falter, a decision was quietly being made in the highest reaches of German command that would ripple through the entire structure of the Wehrmacht's remaining strength. The elite SS Panzer Divisions that had been committed to that desperate offensive, among them the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and elements of the Das Reich Division, were to be withdrawn from the collapsing Ardennes campaign and rerouted eastward, not to Berlin, where the Soviet menace loomed ever closer, not to defend the Rhine or prepare for the American advance, but to Hungary, to Lake Balaton, to attempt one more grand offensive that might, in some flickering corner of the High Command's imagination, change the course of the war on the Eastern Front. The decision itself remains one of the most contested strategic choices of the war's final phase. Hitler, by all accounts, believed that if Germany could recapture the Hungarian oil fields and hold them long enough, if the 6th SS Panzer Army and its supporting formations could punch through Soviet lines and retake the industrial heartland of the South, then perhaps the momentum might shift. Perhaps the Soviets could be forced to pause. Perhaps time itself might be bought. Time for wonder weapons, for political fractures among the Allies, for some miraculous intervention, It was the thinking of a man grasping at shadows. Yet the order came down, and the machinery of German logistics, already strained to the breaking point, began its work. The movement began in earnest in January and early February of 1945. Imagine, if you will, the vast railway networks of occupied Europe in that moment, frozen, congested, vulnerable to constant air attack, yet still somehow carrying the freight of Germany's collapsing military apparatus across hundreds of miles. The SS Panzer Divisions, particularly those units being transferred from west to east, required enormous logistical effort to move. Tanks cannot simply be driven long distances across a winter landscape without catastrophic fuel consumption and mechanical failure. They had to be transported on flat cars, loaded with enormous care, secured, covered, and moved under conditions of strict operational security. Enemy air superiority meant that much of this movement had to occur at night or in poor weather. It was a slow, grinding process that tested every available railway line and consumed fuel and rolling stock that Germany could barely afford to spare. The Leibstandarte, perhaps the most famous of all SS Panzer formations, began its movement from the Ardennes in mid-January. The division had suffered significant losses in the offensive: tanks damaged or destroyed, men killed, equipment abandoned in the snow as the campaign dissolved into retreat. Yet what remained of the Leibstandarte, the hard core of its veteran tankers and panzer grenadiers, was gathered up, refitted as much as possible in the time available, and loaded onto trains. Other divisions followed in a staggered sequence. The Das Reich Division, which had fought from France through the Ardennes and borne the marks of both campaigns, was similarly withdrawn. The Hohenstaufen, the Totenkopf, elements of the Viking Division, all were being sorted, redirected, moved toward the Hungarian theatre. It was logistically one of the most complex movements of the late war period, requiring precise coordination between the Wehrmacht's Transportation Command, the SS Chain of Command, and the political apparatus of the Nazi state, all of which were by this point barely functioning in any coherent manner. Consider for a moment the experience of an ordinary SS Panzer soldier during this movement. He had perhaps survived the Ardennes offensive, had endured weeks of combat in the snow and cold, had seen comrades killed and equipment destroyed. He may have harbored fleeting hopes that the defeat in the West might mean rotation home, or at least a period of rest and refitting in some relatively quiet sector. Instead, he found himself being loaded into cattle cars. Yes, even the elite SS Panzer Divisions used cattle cars for personnel transport, and sent eastward, toward the mysterious Hungarian front, toward an offensive whose purpose was explained to him in propaganda terms that grew more grandiose and less believable with each passing day. What was he thinking as the train rattled through the frozen German landscape, carrying him toward Lake Balaton, and an enemy he knew from bitter experience was far from defeated? The records suggest that morale among these transferred troops was deeply fragmented and complicated. Some of the remaining SS ideologues genuinely believed in the mission, believed that one more great blow might yet turn the tide. These were often younger men, still imbued with Nazi indoctrination, still convinced that their elite status and fanatical dedication might accomplish what mere conventional army units could not. But many of the veterans, the men who had fought in the Ardennes, who had seen the Waffen-SS at its most formidable and yet still unable to prevail, harbored a quieter realism. They had begun to suspect, though few would voice it openly given the SS's notorious internal security apparatus and its willingness to execute soldiers for defeatism, that the war was no longer winnable in any conventional sense. The question for these men was not whether Germany could win, but how long they personally might survive. The movement itself took place over several weeks and was distributed across multiple rail routes to minimize the vulnerability of any single line to air attack. Trains left the Ardennes sector in late January and early February, carrying tanks, self-propelled guns, half-tracks loaded with ammunition and equipment, fuel trucks, ammunition trains, and personnel cars packed with soldiers. The journey from Belgium or eastern France to the staging areas in Austria and western Hungary was a journey of over 1,000 kilometers, and it had to be undertaken through a landscape that was increasingly dominated by enemy air power. The Luftwaffe, what remained of it, attempted to provide fighter cover for these movements, but Germany's air force was now essentially a spent force, capable only of sporadic and local resistance. The trains moved at night whenever possible. During daylight, they halted in tunnels or were dispersed among forests and ravines, camouflaged as much as possible against the certainty that Allied reconnaissance aircraft would spot them. The fuel situation for these movements was dire. Germany was by this point experiencing critical shortages of refined petroleum products. The very oil fields of Hungary that this campaign hoped to capture were, in a sense, the phantom that justified the entire operation, a desperate gamble that seizing them would ease the fuel crisis that was strangling the Wehrmacht's ability to move, to fight, to maintain the mechanized warfare that had once been its great advantage. Yet to move the divisions to Hungary in order to capture these oil fields required consuming massive quantities of fuel. It was a vicious circle of logic, one that perhaps only someone in Hitler's psychological state could embrace with such desperate conviction. Fuel for the trains, fuel for the tanks, fuel for the transport vehicles and lorries, all had to be scraped together from dwindling reserves. Tank crews reported that even as they traveled eastward, their vehicles were being cannibalized for fuel to keep the trains moving. As these units arrived in Hungary, they were dispersed to various staging areas and defensive positions, some as far forward as the line facing the Soviets, others in reserve positions around Lake Balaton, where the offensive preparations were being made. The arrival of these fresh, or at least fresh in terms of their equipment and some reinforcement of their ranks, SS Panzer Divisions was treated in German propaganda as a major infusion of strength, the arrival of Germany's elite armoured force that would surely turn the tide in Hungary. The divisions were reorganised, refitted as much as possible with replacement tanks and vehicles, and brought into the lines alongside Hungarian army units and the regular Wehrmacht formations already in position. But soldiers, even elite SS soldiers, have eyes. They could see the condition of other units they came into contact with. They could see the exhaustion on the faces of men who had been in the line for months. They could sense, in the tone of officers' voices and the quality of the defensive positions they were assigned to hold, that this was not a campaign of confidence, but rather one of desperation. What precisely was their understanding of what was about to happen? The operation, which would come to be called Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, was presented to them as a grand counter-offensive, a massive blow that would drive the Soviets back and recapture vast territories. Yet how many of these exhausted veterans, arriving in Hungary after weeks of transportation and having lost comrades and equipment in the Ardennes, truly believed that yet another major offensive could succeed? The SS, with its intense political indoctrination and its system of officers trained to demand absolute compliance, maintained discipline and morale through a combination of ideological conviction and the threat of severe punishment for defeatism. But beneath the surface, there must have been currents of doubt, of weariness, of a growing sense that they were being asked to throw their lives away for an outcome that was already determined. How do men cope with such knowledge? How do they prepare mentally for an offensive they suspect will fail? These are questions that the historical record can only partially answer, but they speak to the human experience of war in its final, most desperate phase. As February gave way to early March, the preparations accelerated. The divisions were brought into their final assault positions. Supply lines were established as best they could be. Plans were drawn and redrawn, Officers briefed their men on the objectives, the routes, the expected resistance. And somewhere deep in the consciousness of these elite German soldiers, a knowledge was settling in like the thaw that was beginning to soften the frozen Hungarian plains. The knowledge that they were about to participate in what would be Germany's last great armoured offensive of the war, an operation that would consume some of the Reich's remaining strength and elite manpower in what many of them, in their quieter moments, must have already suspected would be a final, grand, and futile gesture. The Hungarian plain in March of 1945 bore no resemblance to the snow-covered landscape that had greeted the Panzer Divisions just weeks before. The frost had begun its slow retreat northward, and in its place came something far more troublesome for armoured warfare, the thaw. The roads, never well maintained even in better times, had transformed into ribbons of mud, the kind that seized tank tracks and held them fast, that turned the landscape into a vast bog where momentum itself became a luxury few could afford. The sky hung low and grey over the Puszta, that ancient Hungarian steppe, and the wind carried with it the smell of damp earth and distant rain. It was the kind of weather that seemed to whisper caution to anyone with eyes to see it, yet such whispers went unheeded in the command posts where grand designs were still being drawn. The Danube Valley, where much of the coming offensive would unfold, presented a geography both complex and unforgiving. Lake Balaton itself sprawled across the landscape like a vast inland sea, nearly 30 miles from north to south, and its mere presence complicated every movement, every supply line, every maneuver that the German planners envisioned. To the north of Balaton lay Lake Valence, smaller but still significant, and between these two bodies of water ran the only realistic corridors through which armour could move. The terrain grew increasingly hilly as one ventured westward toward the Austrian border, and these low, rolling hills, dotted with dense forests and small villages, would prove far more defensible than any open steppe. The Danube itself cut through everything like a barrier, drawn by nature itself, its width and swift current making any crossing a feat of engineering and courage. Can you envision the complexity? A general wishing to conduct an armoured offensive in such terrain faced not merely an enemy, but the land itself as an adversary. The Soviets understood this terrain intimately. They had studied it, mapped it, fortified it, and throughout January and February of 1945, while German formations were slowly being assembled and positioned in the Lake region, the Red Army had been methodically constructing what would become one of the most formidable defensive positions of the entire Eastern Front. The layers of preparation were extraordinary. Multiple defensive belts, each one positioned to provide mutual support and fields of interlocking fire. The first line, closer to the anticipated German jumping-off positions, consisted of interconnected trenches, anti-tank ditches, and foxholes, arranged in a pattern that Soviet engineers had refined through 4 years of bitter warfare. Behind this, often several kilometers back, stood a second defensive line, equally prepared, equally daunting, and behind that, a third and sometimes even a fourth position, creating a depth of defense that could absorb and dissipate almost any single blow. Soviet anti-tank defenses had reached a level of sophistication that would have seemed almost impossible just a year or two earlier. The T-34 tank, that revolutionary machine which had first shocked German crews in 1941, had evolved further, with thicker armour and more powerful guns. Vast numbers of anti-tank guns, the famous 45mm guns, the larger 76mm pieces, and the fearsome 85mm anti-tank rifles had been positioned in carefully chosen killing grounds. These weren't scattered carelessly across the landscape, but rather positioned with mathematical precision, their fields of fire calculated so that a German tank unable to advance in one direction would be forced into the sights of another anti-tank gun, positioned at a slightly different angle. The Soviets had learned through terrible experience that mass alone, without coordination and careful positioning, would be devoured by well-prepared defense. The spring of 1945 would not be a repetition of earlier blunders. The weather forecast, such as it existed in 1945, suggested that March would bring continuing thaw and mud. German reconnaissance reports noted the unpredictable nature of conditions, some days clear enough for air operations, most days shrouded in low cloud and precipitation that would ground the Luftwaffe almost completely. The Soviet Air Force, meanwhile, had achieved something extraordinary by this point in the war. They had become, in many sectors, the masters of the sky. With fighters like the Yak-3 and La-5, they had begun to achieve superiority in ways that would have seemed miraculous to pilots fighting in 1942. The German Luftwaffe, starved for fuel, for replacement aircraft, for experienced pilots, could offer little resistance. How does an armored offensive prosper when your opponent owns the sky above you? The question hung uneasily over all the planning sessions. The German High Command, nonetheless, pressed forward with the preparations for what they called Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening. There was almost a desperate poetry in the name, as though naming it after renewal and rebirth might somehow transform the grim reality of committing exhausted, depleted formations to an offensive that defied every rational assessment. The concentration of forces was real. Elite Panzer and SS Panzer Divisions, some hastily pulled from other sectors, others scraped together from reserves and reformations. Tank strength in some divisions had been restored to something approaching full complement, at least on paper. Ammunition stocks, while never adequate to German thinking, had been gathered from across the Reich. Fuel had been reserved for the offensive, fuel that might otherwise have been used for training or moving reserves to Berlin to defend against what many sensed was the real threat, not Soviet conquest in the East, but the final collapse of the German state itself. Yet, as the divisions moved into their assembly areas through February and into early March, a strange melancholy seemed to accompany them. The soldiers, many of them veterans of years of continuous warfare, could read a landscape and understand what it meant. They saw the Soviet preparations, or at least they saw enough. The patterns of disturbed earth that suggested trenches, the rumor networks that always seemed to know when new artillery had arrived in a sector, the evidence of the endless Soviet reserves that simply kept appearing, kept rebuilding shattered units, kept rotating fresh troops into line, while German divisions fought with the same exhausted personnel day after day after day. What did they speak of in the darkness of their bivouacs? Perhaps some still harbored hope that this new offensive, this spring awakening, might somehow reverse the terrible momentum of the war. More likely, many understood in the quiet way that soldiers understand such things, that they were moving towards something that could not be stopped, only endured, survived if one was fortunate. The Hungarian plain awaited them, with its mud and its thaw, its lakes and its rivers, its carefully prepared Soviet defenses layered deep like geological strata. The moment of launching Operation Frühlingserwachen was drawing near. The tanks and self-propelled guns were fueled and positioned. The infantry units were moved into their assembly areas. Orders flowed downward through the chains of command, each one slightly different, depending on whose sector was being described, whose division was doing the describing. The weather remained unpredictable, clear one day, obscured by cloud and drizzle the next. And somewhere above, or perhaps merely above the horizon, the moon continued its indifferent wax and wane, unconcerned with human ambition and human desperation. On the morning of March 6, 1945, the Hungarian plain lay caught between seasons. Winter's grip had loosened, but not yet released. The temperature had climbed just enough that the frozen earth was beginning to weep, and across those vast agricultural flatlands, the thaw was transforming the ground into something neither solid nor entirely liquid, a kind of dark, clinging mud that would become the true antagonist of the coming hours. Before dawn, the SS Panzer Divisions had begun their movement toward their jump-off positions. The rumble of tank engines carried across the landscape in low, heavy waves. Thousands of men were awake in the darkness, running final checks on weapons that had already been checked a dozen times before. There was a particular quality to the sound of German tank engines at that hour. Diesel fuel mixed with the last cold of the night, creating a kind of growling that had become, for soldiers who had heard it across 5 years of war, almost familiar, almost comforting, in the way that the known darkness of your own bedroom might comfort you more than an unfamiliar light. The panzer regiments had spent days positioning themselves. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the division that had once served as Hitler's personal bodyguard and had evolved into one of the Reich's most formidable armoured formations, was positioned in the north. Around them and behind them, the Das Reich division, the Hohenstaufen, and others were settling into their staging areas. The earth beneath the tank tracks was already beginning to show the trauma of assembly. Where thousands of tons of steel had moved into position, the mud was churned into a darker paste, almost black, sticky in a way that would prove increasingly problematic as the morning progressed. The men inside those tanks, the commanders, gunners, drivers, loaders, were aware that this operation, Spring Awakening, represented something different from what had come before. It was to be the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. Whether they fully understood that, whether they felt it in some intuitive way despite the propaganda assurances of their officers, remains a question we might wonder about. What did they believe about their chances? What hope, if any, had been given to them in those pre-dawn hours? The infantry divisions assigned to support the armour were less comfortable. They did not have the roofs of steel over their heads. As the darkness began its imperceptible shift toward the pale grey of very early morning, they moved forward on foot through mud that already clung to their boots. The longer the approach march lasted, the more exhausted they became. This was true not because of the distance was manageable, but because of the constant resistance the earth offered. Every step required effort. After an hour of it, the legs were tired. After 2 hours, the thighs burned. After 3, men were breathing heavily, their attention narrowing to the immediate sensation of mud and cold and the need to keep moving. By the time the first light of March 6th became visible on the eastern horizon, the Hungarian plain had transformed into something between a staging ground and a battlefield. The forward positions were occupied, the artillery was in place, the preliminary bombardment had begun, or was about to begin, depending on which sector of the advance one considered. The sound was immense, not loud in the way that a sudden noise might be loud, but rather enveloping, a deep, rolling vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Thousands upon thousands of shells were being launched towards Soviet positions. The coordination required was staggering, and yet, as these bombardments had unfolded countless times before across Eastern Europe and Russia, they followed patterns that had become, in some sense, routine. The Soviet defenses in this sector were substantial, but not impenetrable. The Red Army, despite its recent victories and its superior numbers, was not a monolith of preparedness. There were gaps in their lines. There were sectors where alertness had perhaps diminished. There were commanders of lesser skill and positions of less critical importance. Yet the overall picture was one of significant defensive strength. The Soviets had learned, over the course of 5 years, how to position their anti-tank guns, how to layer their defenses, how to maintain reserves that could be brought forward when breakthroughs threatened. As the artillery preparation reached its crescendo, the tank crews heard the call to start engines. This was the moment toward which everything had been building. The massive diesel engines turned over, coughed, and then settled into their heavy, rhythmic growl. The the vibration moved through the crew compartments, a feeling that became almost meditative for men who had experienced it many times before. The vehicle commanders, standing with their heads just above the rim of their turrets, scanned the grey landscape ahead. The terrain rolled gently, nothing dramatic, but offering small valleys and rises that could provide cover or tactical opportunity. The mud gleamed in the weak morning light. The advance began not with a dramatic surge, but with a methodical forward movement. The tanks moved in formation, their commanders communicating through headsets, the drivers feeling their way forward through the mud with a delicate sense of balance. Too fast, and the vehicle would become stuck or vulnerable. Too slow, and the infantry following behind would lose cohesion, and the entire operation would lose momentum. There was a speed that was right, and finding it required experience and skill. The mud was worse than anyone had anticipated. This is a detail worth lingering on, because the mud would define the experience of this entire opening phase in ways that no amount of strategy or numerical superiority could overcome. As the tanks moved forward, their tracks found purchase in the softened earth, but only barely. The weight of the vehicle, a Panther tank weighed nearly 50 tons, a Tiger II could exceed 60, pressed down on the mud. With each meter of forward movement, the mud seemed to grip back, as if reluctant to release the vehicle. The drivers felt this as a kind of resistance that required constant adjustment. Where the ground appeared firm, it often was not. Where it appeared soft, it was sometimes better than expected. The sensation for the man in the driver's seat, the only crew member in a tank who actually looked out at the terrain directly through his viewing port, was one of continuous negotiation. The vehicle was moving, yes, but not smoothly. There was a kind of stuttering to its progress, a forward motion interrupted by small stalls and reaccelerations. Behind the lead tanks, following in their wake, the infantry moved in small groups, using the armor as shelter from the Soviet defensive fire that had begun in earnest. Artillery shells descended, both German shells meant for Soviet positions ahead and Soviet shells meant for German positions behind. The ground around the advancing columns shook with explosions. The mud, already treacherous, became more so as it was chewed and rechewed by the boots of thousands of men and the tracks of hundreds of vehicles. What was the experience of being one of those men, moving forward through that grey mud on that cold morning? The sensory detail would have been overwhelming in some ways and numbingly absent in others. The cold, still present despite the thaw, would have been felt in the extremities. The smell of diesel fuel, disturbed earth, and smoke would have been pervasive. The sound was never not present. The engines, the gunfire, the shouting of officers and non-commissioned officers, the cries of wounded men. Yet there was also, in many accounts that have survived from participants, a kind of focus that emerged. The mind seemed to narrow. The larger questions of whether this offensive could succeed, whether the war was already lost, whether any of this made sense, these questions fell away. What remained was the immediate task. Place your foot forward, keep your formation, watch for anti-tank guns in the village ahead, feed ammunition to the loader, speak calmly to the driver about the terrain ahead. These small, contained concerns seemed to be what the mind could actually grasp. The tanks, struggling forward through the mud, were nonetheless making progress. The Leibstandartes columns advanced several kilometers in those opening hours. The Das Reich pushed forward. The Hohenstaufen and the other divisions engaged. It was not the rapid breakthrough that had been hoped for, but it was movement in the right direction, and in warfare, particularly in warfare on the verge of collapse, forward movement carried its own psychological weight. Officers spoke to their men about the gains being made. Optimism, or something resembling it, flickered across the radio networks and moved from tank to tank in whispered conversations. Yet as the morning progressed, something was becoming clear to those commanders paying close attention. The The resistance was stiffer than expected. The Soviet defenses were deeper. The terrain, already difficult, was becoming more so as more vehicles churned the mud into something increasingly unforgiving. Several tanks had already bogged down entirely, unable to move forward or back. These vehicles did not remain immobile for long. They became targets, and in many cases, their crews had to abandon them, making their way back on foot through the same mud that their tanks could no longer navigate. The spring thaw that had begun as a minor inconvenience was becoming a significant problem. Water was running off from higher ground. Small streams were swelling. What had been mere mud in the early hours was transitioning into something more like a morass. The tracks of the leading vehicles sank deeper with each pass. The roads, such as they were dissolving. The Hungarian plain, at that particular moment in history, was refusing to cooperate with the ambitions of German strategic planning. The 6th SS Panzer Army, under the command of Sepp Dietrich, had been tasked with the primary thrust, the main effort that would, if all went according to Hitler's vision, punch through the Soviet lines in a direction that seemed almost west by design, as though the geography itself had been consulted. They would drive north and northwest from their assembly areas around Lake Balaton, moving through the narrow strip of terrain that lay between the shores of Balaton to the south and the smaller expanse of Lake Valence to the north. It was terrain that compressed the advancing columns into corridors, funneling armor and infantry into approaches where Soviet defenders could concentrate their fire, though perhaps Dietrich and his officers believed the sheer weight of those divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Hohenstaufen, would simply break through whatever stood in their way. In the quiet hours before dawn on March 6th, the engines had roared to life across a wide front, and the first waves of tanks began to move northward into the muddy threshold between those two lakes, toward villages whose names would soon be written into unit records and then forgotten by almost everyone except the soldiers who fought there. The initial momentum had been unmistakable. The Soviet forward positions, stretched thin across miles of difficult terrain, had crumbled under the weight of concentrated armor. Panzer Grenadier regiments advanced on foot behind the rolling columns of panzers, taking villages that had been hastily abandoned, finding Soviet anti-tank guns still warm where they had been spiked and left behind. For perhaps the first 3 or 4 days of the offensive, a certain electricity ran through the Waffen-SS formations, not quite hope, but something adjacent to it, a sense that perhaps this last gamble might actually yield something, some miraculous reversal of fortunes. The advance had gained perhaps 20 kilometers in the opening phase, a considerable depth for such an operation, and photographs from those hours showed tank crews with almost unguarded expressions, a lightness that had been absent from their faces for months. How far had they actually believed they might push? How many of them, deep within the silence of their own thoughts, dared to wonder if this offensive, this spring awakening, as the Germans called it, might be the turning point they had been promised? But the Soviet command had been preparing for this assault with meticulous care. Marshal Tolbukin and his subordinates had mapped the approaches, identified the likely corridors of advance, and positioned reserves behind the initial defensive lines with patient calculation. The Soviet defenders fell back in those opening days not in panicked rout, but in what appeared to be almost ritualistic withdrawals, each position contested just enough to slow the German advance without being held to the point of encirclement. The Soviet reserves, fresh mechanized corps, artillery concentrations that were themselves almost incomprehensible in their density, waited in the second and third lines like a gathering storm that the advancing Germans could sense but not yet fully perceive. By March 8th and 9th, as the 6th Panzer Army pushed further north and the terrain grew more broken and wooded, the pace of the German advance had begun to noticeably slow. The roads, such as they were, had transformed into channels of mud where entire supply columns could become bogged for hours, and the spring thaw was accelerating with each passing day, turning what had been frozen earth into something closer to porridge. The resistance had begun to stiffen perceptibly as the German columns pushed deeper into what the Soviets had anticipated would be the main axis of the attack. Tank engagements became more frequent and more fierce. Soviet T-34s and the heavier JS tanks would appear suddenly from tree lines or hull-down positions in the undulating landscape, engaging the German panzers in tactical duels where the advantage of German gunnery and crew training sometimes prevailed, but at increasingly heavy cost in machines and veteran crews. The Panther tanks and the Tigers of the Das Reich Division conducted themselves with the competence born of years of experience, but experience alone could not overcome the mathematical reality. The Soviets were feeding fresh armor into the line faster than the Germans could destroy it. The supply lines stretching back toward the German assembly areas grew more tenuous with each passing day. Fuel, which had always been precious, became almost agonizing in its scarcity. A panzer division that had begun the offensive at full strength began to see its operational tanks drop from day to day, not so much from catastrophic losses in combat, as from breakdowns on the mud-choked roads, from vehicles abandoned because fuel could not be spared to repair them, from the simple exhaustion of machines that had been pushed far beyond their designed tolerances. The human cost accumulated in quieter ways during this phase. Panzer grenadiers dismounted in the cold dawn to assault Soviet positions, and while they sometimes succeeded in taking ground, the casualties among the foot soldiers began to mount more visibly than the tank losses. A company that had begun the operation with perhaps 80 or 90 men might find itself reduced to 40 or 50 within a week of fighting, and the replacements, when they arrived at all, were often conscripts or stragglers gathered from rear areas, men without the cohesion or training of the original formations. The once formidable Waffen-SS divisions had always prided themselves on their selectivity, their recruitment from men deemed ideologically pure and physically superior. But by March 1945, such niceties had largely evaporated. The divisions were taking whoever they could get, and the quality of the reinforcements told a story in itself about the state of the German war machine. By the second week of March, the northern thrust had gained perhaps 30 to 35 kilometers, a respectable penetration perhaps, but nowhere near the breakthrough that Hitler had envisioned. The Soviet defenses had bent, significantly bent, but they had not broken. The German columns had become increasingly exhausted, their supply lines increasingly overstretched. Soviet reserves were flowing into the theater with what seemed like inexhaustible abundance. The weather had turned against the Germans as well, as it so often did. The mud grew deeper, the days longer and warmer, the nights less cold and crisp. Tank crews found themselves working in conditions of exhausting dirtiness, trying to maintain machines in terrain that seemed almost hostile to the very concept of mechanized warfare. And somewhere ahead, always just out of reach, lay the hope of a decisive breakthrough. But it was becoming apparent to anyone with eyes to see that such a breakthrough was no longer likely. The Soviets were simply too strong, too numerous, too well prepared in this particular theater. Could the German commanders, could Dietrich himself, sense in those muddy middle days of March that the offensive had already failed, even as the fighting continued? Perhaps, or perhaps they still believed, because belief was all that remained, and belief cost nothing, required no fuel or ammunition, and could be maintained right up to the moment of final defeat. While the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich drove northward between the two lakes in what was meant to be the primary thrust of Spring Awakening, the operation's southern flank depended on a far more fragile arrangement, a coalition of forces operating under a command structure that had never quite learned to breathe in unison. Here, in the lower reaches of the Hungarian plain south and east of Lake Balaton, 2nd Panzer Army under Colonel General Maximilian von Weichs would attempt to wheel inward and support Dietrich's drive, while Army Group E, operating from the south under General Alexander Löhr, was tasked with protecting the flank and driving northeastward toward the Danube. On paper, in the careful geometries of a staff map, these movements seemed complementary, almost elegant, but elegance dissolves quickly when men, machines, and weather conspire against coordination. The terrain here was fundamentally different from the northern sector. Where the region between the lakes offered some hardened ground and elevation, the southern approach stretched across lower, muddier plains that had been turned to glutinous paste by the thaw. Forests, marshes, and small villages created a landscape that favored neither rapid advance nor clear observation. The roads, what could charitably be called roads, became quagmires almost immediately once the snow retreated and the spring sun warmed the surface while the earth beneath remained frozen. Tank commanders learned swiftly that their vehicles, for all their armor and power, could sink into this landscape like heavy stones dropping through dark water. Traction became an obsession. Fuel consumption surged as engines labored through mud that seemed to possess its own gravitational pull. 2nd Panzer Army's forces included Panzer Grenadier Divisions, panzer battalions drawn from various sources, and supporting infantry, but they lacked the concentrated armor of Dietrich's formations. Moreover, the men who made up these units were, on average, younger, less thoroughly trained, and still carrying the exhaustion of previous campaigns. Many had been cobbled together from replacement pools and damaged units that had limped westward after the Soviet winter offensives. Officers commanding them were competent, often resourceful, but they were working with human material that was growing progressively more fragile. How does one maintain discipline and momentum when the soldiers themselves are running on fumes, when they've seen their comrades disappear into snowbanks and mud for weeks on end? Army Group E's situation was even more constrained. Löhr's formation consisted primarily of lower-grade divisions, ethnic German units, Croatian auxiliaries, and skeletal German formations that had been scraped together from occupation duties in Greece and the Balkans. Some of these troops had never seen serious combat. Others were conscripts from conquered territories, whose loyalty to the Reich ranged from uncertain to actively hostile. The command structure itself was loose, almost provisional. Army Group E had been fighting a slow, grinding campaign against Yugoslav partisans under Tito, and the sudden redirection northward meant abandoning hard-won territorial gains and committing men who had no context for, and precious little enthusiasm about, the desperate gamble unfolding in Hungary. Löhr himself was a veteran officer, but his authority extended tenuously across formations that had their own regional loyalties, supply lines, and grievances. The coordination between these two German commands, 2nd Panzer Army and Army Group E, never achieved the synchronization that OKH planners had intended. Messages traveled slowly. Subordinate commanders, facing local crises and deteriorating situations, made decisions that served their immediate sector but undercut the broader offensive design. A delay in one sector meant a gap elsewhere. A success in one location couldn't be reinforced because reserves were committed to plugging a hole 10 kilometers away. The machinery of command, which had functioned with brutal efficiency in better days, was now grinding with a sound uncomfortably close to breaking metal. But the coordination difficulties extended beyond German-to-German communication. The operation depended on cooperation with German allies and vassal states, Hungary itself, Romania, and elements of various satellite militaries. Here, the friction became almost visible. The Hungarian government, such as it was in the spring of 1945, existed in a state of profound unreality. The regent, Miklos Horthy, had tried to withdraw from the war in late 1944, but had been deposed by an SS commando raid. The Arrow Cross, Hungary's native fascist movement, had been installed as a puppet administration, but their authority was hollow and their popular support non-existent. Hungarian troops, where they existed in coherent units, were being pressed into service alongside the Germans, but their morale was catastrophic. Why should a Hungarian soldier die to restore the Reich's oil supplies when everyone could see that the war was already lost? Desertions were frequent, units melted away. Some soldiers deliberately performed poorly. The strain of coalition warfare, one historian has observed, was not merely a matter of logistics and commands. It was a matter of making men care about a cause when their nation was already defeated, already occupied, already ransacked by both the Nazis and the Soviets in turn. Romanian units added another layer of complication. Romania, like Hungary, had been forced into alliance with Germany after its brutal subjugation. Romania's forces were numerically significant, but organizationally marginal to German command. Communication was difficult. Orders often traveled through multiple translation layers. Romanian officers had their own chain of command, their own territorial concerns, and their own desperate calculation about which way to position themselves as the Reich collapsed. Some Romanian units fought with relative earnestness. Others were already engaged in quiet negotiations with Soviet representatives, hedging their bets for the post-war period. Supply coordination across this coalition structure became a logistical nightmare. German units expected German supplies, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, according to established procedures. Hungarian and Romanian units required different ammunition types, different fuel specifications, different maintenance protocols. The rail lines converging on the Hungarian plain were already stretched and frequently under air attack. Supplying a coalition operation meant maintaining multiple parallel supply chains in an environment where a single damaged bridge could cascade through the entire system. The southern sector suffered particularly from fuel shortages. Tanks that did manage to advance burned fuel at prodigious rates in the mud. Fuel trucks arrived late or not at all. By the third or fourth day of the offensive, some 2nd Panzer Army units were operating at half rations of diesel. Consider, if you will, the experience of a panzer commander, a young Obersturmbannführer, perhaps, sitting in the cupola of his tank early on the second day of the offensive, watching the horizon where Soviet artillery began to speak. He had coordinated with his divisional staff that morning, received orders to advance along a specific axis, move through a village, and establish a position to the northeast. Simple enough. But then word arrived that the Hungarian unit, supposed to be on his left, was nowhere to be found. They'd received different orders, or interpreted their orders differently, or simply hadn't arrived. A gap opened. The Soviets, whose intelligence network was far superior to the Germans by this point, identified the gap almost immediately. Anti-tank guns were wheeled into position. The advance, which should have swept forward, instead became a careful crawl, punctuated by sudden violence. How many times did this pattern repeat across the southern sector? How many carefully drawn arrows on the operations map became hesitations and deviations when they met the chaos of actual terrain and actual men? The German General Staff had built the Wehrmacht on a doctrine of aggressive movement and decisive breakthrough. But that doctrine had always assumed sufficient armor, sufficient air cover, sufficient fuel, and sufficient coordination among allies. In Hungary in March 1945, none of those assumptions held true. The southern effort limped forward, gained a few kilometers here and there, but never achieved the momentum or the breakthrough that might have justified the sacrifices being made. And yet men continued to be committed, equipment continued to be consumed, and hope, that strange commodity that sustained even the hopelessly outmatched, continued to propel forward those who believed, rightly or wrongly, that one more push might change everything. The strain of that coalition warfare, the strain of coordinating forces that were fragmenting, the strain of maintaining discipline among troops who could see the future collapsing around them, these stresses accumulated silently, like frost collecting on a winter window. The southern offensive would become not a breakthrough but a slow erosion, a gradual comprehension that even the most elite formations could not overcome the simple fact that Germany was losing, that its allies were failing, and that no amount of coordination or courage could rebuild the foundations of a war that was already lost. As the offensive rolled forward across the Hungarian landscape in those opening days of March, the great machinery of war, the tanks, the supply lines, the coordinated movements of thousands, all depended on something far more fragile and intimate than strategy or fuel. It depended on the men inside the machines, on their ability to endure cold, hunger, monotony, and the knowledge that death waited in the mud around them. And the daily rhythm of their survival, though largely forgotten in the sweep of military history, tells us something quieter and more human about what war actually felt like when lived, rather than commanded. Consider the morning inside a Tiger or Panther tank as it idled in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for orders to move. The crew, usually 5 men in tight, unheated quarters, surrounded by the smell of diesel fuel, grease, and the accumulated sweat of men who hadn't washed in days, would begin their ritual with tea or weak coffee heated on a small camp stove they'd rigged near the engine block. The coffee was rarely actual coffee by 1945, more often a mixture of roasted barley or chicory, sometimes with fragments of real beans if they'd been fortunate the night before. One veteran, a gunner in a Das Reich Panther, later described those mornings as the only moments of peace in an otherwise chaotic day. A few minutes of warmth cupped in frozen hands, the taste almost immaterial compared to the simple fact of something hot sliding down the throat. Food, of course, was always a negotiation with scarcity. The official ration for German tank crews was designed to sustain them: bread, often hard and grey and made from potato flour, canned meat, sometimes marmalade or a thin spread of margarine. But the reality was far more erratic. Supply lines stretched thin across the frozen landscape. When rations reached the divisions at all, they came hours late, or already depleted by officers and support staff higher up the chain. Many crews supplemented their rations by trading with infantry units or local Hungarians, exchanging ammunition or captured supplies for vegetables, eggs, or schnapps. The Ukrainian volunteers attached to some panzer companies, they were numerous in the later SS divisions, would sometimes disappear at dawn to forage in surrounding villages, returning with bread, preserved fruit, or fresh meat if they'd managed to find livestock. These transactions were technically forbidden, but the discipline of the Waffen-SS, even at this late stage, often looked the other way when it came to keeping crews fed enough to function. The cramped quarters of a tank bred a peculiar intimacy among crew members. 5 men, sometimes 7 if officers squeezed inside, lived in conditions of almost monastic closeness. The commander sat in the turret, with the best visibility. The gunner worked the main cannon. The loader fed ammunition into the breech. The driver gripped his controls in the front left, and the wireless operator managed communications from the turret's cramped back. In a Panther or Tiger, there was perhaps 2 meters of internal space, all of it taken up by machinery, ammunition storage, and human bodies. Fatigue set in quickly, especially for the driver and loader, whose roles demanded constant physical exertion. The loader in particular, he might hoist a 45-kilogram shell into the breech dozens of times in a day of combat, his shoulders burning, sweat pouring in the enclosed metal box even in March cold because the friction of fire generated tremendous heat. Sleep became a negotiated matter of minutes and hours stolen whenever the offensive paused. Crews would rotate off watch, collapsing into whatever shelter they could find, sometimes in the tank itself, curled up against ammunition racks or across the hull, more often in dugouts or hastily erected tents nearby. The exhaustion ran so deep that men would fall asleep standing, propped against a panzer's side, and wake without any memory of having dozed. Veterans from Hohenstaufen described what they called a kind of walking sleep, where your body moved and responded to orders while your mind had simply shut down somewhere else. One radio operator wrote in a letter to his wife, which never reached her, that he couldn't remember the last day when he'd slept for more than 2 hours at a stretch. The stress of expecting attack, of listening for Soviet engines in the darkness, kept the nervous system permanently alert, even when the body was technically resting. The rituals of survival became almost religious in their repetition. Before a major attack, crews would check ammunition counts, verify fuel levels, and run through the mechanical systems that kept the panzer alive. But they would also, almost universally, write letters home. The mail service was still functioning, however erratically, and men would find moments between operations to scribble notes on small sheets of paper, addressing them to wives, mothers, girlfriends back in Germany. The letters rarely spoke directly of fear or doubt. Military censorship and simple convention forbade it. But they dwelled on small things: the memory of a particular meal, a childhood dog, the color of a girl's eyes. Some men developed fetishes of touch, carrying small objects from home, a photograph, a medal, a pressed flower, and would hold them during the waiting periods as a kind of prayer made tactile. Others developed smoking habits that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with something to do with their hands, something to mark the passage of time. The infantry riding on the panzer decks, and during Operation Frühlingserwachen, thousands of Waffen-SS grenadiers clung to the outer surfaces of tanks, huddled against turrets and trying to shield themselves from wind and spatter, inhabited an almost unimaginable world of misery. Exposed to the elements, pressed against ice-cold metal that had been overheated by engine friction only minutes before, bouncing across rutted terrain, these men existed in a state of constant discomfort that bordered on torture. They ate their rations standing or sitting on frozen earth. They urinated where they stood, because dismounting to find privacy meant risking being left behind. Some would simply accept frostbite on their feet, rather than remove boots to treat the damage. Trench foot, that ancient scourge of soldiers, was endemic by mid-March, and men would limp forward knowing that without treatment, the infection might cost them their toes or their legs. Yet there was, remarkably, still camaraderie. The Waffen-SS divisions, particularly the older ones, like Leibstandarte and Das Reich, maintained a strange esprit despite everything. Men knew each other's names, knew which commander would look after you if you were wounded, knew which squad leaders would make reasonable decisions and which would order pointless attacks. Veterans trained younger men, passed on the small knowledge that might keep them alive: how to spot a Soviet anti-tank gun emplacement, how to muffle the sound of a tank engine to avoid detection, which Hungarian villages had already been stripped of supplies and which might still have something to trade. The cynicism was complete by March 1945. No one believed in the Führer or final victory anymore. But they believed, or pretended to believe for each other's sake, that doing their duty meant looking after the man next to you. As night fell over the Hungarian plains, the divisions would settle into defensive positions if they'd made territorial gains, or they'd regroup and recover from mauling if the day had been costly. The cooks, those remarkable men who somehow created food from nothing in the back of a field kitchen truck, would distribute their evening rations, and men would huddle around small fires that had to be kept low to avoid drawing Soviet artillery fire. Conversations would turn desultory, almost dreamlike. Men would talk about the war in the past tense without quite realizing they were doing so. They would speculate, with the peculiar exhaustion-bred fatalism that comes after weeks of continuous combat, about whether they would see spring flowers or summer or anything beyond the next week. Some would clean their weapons not because it was required, but because the ritual of oiling and checking was soothing, something familiar in a landscape that had become alien and hostile. Others would simply sit in silence, listening to the sound of wind across the steppes and the distant rumble of Soviet engines, and wondering, in that quiet way that soldiers wonder, whether this was the night everything would finally end. The first week of the offensive had brought something almost like hope to the German commanders. Tanks had advanced, ground had been taken. For a moment, the machinery of panzer warfare seemed to remember what it had once been. But by the 10th of March, something deeper had already begun to shift, something that no divisional strength report or operational summary could quite capture until it was far too late. The mud was one part of it, and perhaps the simplest to understand. The spring thaw that comes to Hungary in early March is not gentle. The soil around Lake Balaton, saturated with winter moisture, begins to break apart under its own weight. Tank treads, even the broad tracks of Panther and Tiger machines, start to sink. What was meant to be swift, armored breakthrough becomes something closer to a desperate crawl through deepening slurry. Visibility drops. Supply lines stretch and fray. A division that should move 40 kilometers in a day moves 15, then 10. Fuel consumption climbs, and somewhere along those muddy roads, the margin between victory and exhaustion begins to narrow in ways that are almost imperceptible until they become absolute. But the mud was not the real problem. It was only the landscape's honest reflection of a deeper condition. By mid-March, the Soviet reserves that Zhukov and Tolbukin had held in careful reserve were beginning to arrive on the battlefield. This is perhaps the moment to pause and consider what that phrase truly meant. The Red Army, even in March of 1945, still possessed reserves, entire mechanized corps, fresh artillery divisions, anti-tank brigades with newer guns. These were not hastily conscripted infantry battalions with 3 weeks of training. They were formations that had learned their trade in the cauldrons of Kursk and Ukraine, hardened by winter operations, equipped with ammunition and fuel that the Germans simply no longer possessed in equivalent quantities. The German intelligence services were aware of Soviet reinforcements arriving. Reports came in steadily. A reconnaissance aircraft would spot a fresh column on the roads east of Budapest. A prisoner, interrogated after a skirmish, would speak of units newly arrived from the north. But there is often a peculiar disconnect between knowing a fact and understanding its weight. The commanders at divisional and corps level could read the reports. They could mark the Soviet positions on their maps. But to truly comprehend that every day now brought fresh enemy formations into the line while their own divisions were getting smaller, not larger, was a kind of psychological threshold that many found difficult to cross. The 6th SS Panzer Army, which had been driving north and east of Lake Balaton with increasing difficulty, began to encounter Soviet defenses that grew thicker and more sophisticated with each passing day. Where there had been screening forces and hastily prepared positions, there were now dug-in anti-tank guns, tank reserves held in echelon, and infantry in prepared field fortifications. The difference was not dramatic enough to make the front lines suddenly impassable, but it was real enough that every objective took longer. Every kilometer of advance cost more tanks. Every engagement left German crews more exhausted, more conscious of the narrowing odds. What makes this moment particularly poignant, when viewed through the lens of time, is that very few officers on either side fully grasped that the true turning point had arrived. And the German commanders could still tell themselves that if the weather improved, if the supply situation stabilized, if reserves were somehow scraped together from other fronts, momentum might be regained. It was not yet hopeless. Hopelessness requires clarity about the future, and clarity was becoming a rare luxury. The Soviet commanders, for their part, understood that their opponent was weakening, but they could not yet know with absolute certainty whether this German offensive would run out of fuel and forward momentum in the next week, or whether it might somehow gather itself for one more desperate lunge. Defensive operations have their own uncertainty. You can see your enemy tiring, but you cannot always know when he will finally stop trying. Consider the experience of a Panther tank crew in the second week of the offensive. The gunner, let us say, was perhaps 22 years old, a veteran of earlier campaigns. He had seen the machine's 75mm gun penetrate Soviet armor. He had rotated in his turret under fire and lived through it. But by mid-March, something had changed in the rhythm of combat. Engagements were happening against better-positioned Soviet guns. Tank losses in his unit were climbing. The infantry that was supposed to support their advance seemed to move slower, as though weighted down by something more than mud. At night, when the engines finally stopped and silence fell across the assembly areas, he might have noticed that the older men spoke less than before. That laughter, when it came, sounded thinner. The supply officers were experiencing their own quiet crisis. Fuel, always precious, was now being rationed in a way that suggested, without quite saying so, that the offensive might have a defined ending point. Ammunition was abundant by Eastern Front standards, but the rate of consumption in intense engagements was climbing. Medical officers were reporting that the number of psychiatric casualties, men who could no longer function under the strain, often without visible wounds, had increased sharply. These were the whispers that made their way through the German command structure, facts that everyone knew but few said aloud. Somewhere in this fog of mid-March uncertainty, the real decision was being made, though not in any conference room or with any formal order. The 6th SS Panzer Army would continue to attack for several more days, even weeks. Gains would be measured in kilometers, then in hundreds of meters. The offensive would develop a terrible momentum of its own, a thing that must continue because it had begun, because stopping seemed like admission of defeat, because standing still in the path of a Soviet counteroffensive was even more dangerous than slowly advancing into prepared positions. But the window for anything resembling success had already closed. The mechanism had begun to slow. The machine that once crushed everything before it was discovering, in the mud of Hungary, that there were limits to what will and steel could accomplish against an enemy that had learned to wait, to absorb, and to strike back with resources that were still being fed into the line. What none of them could yet fully see, as the second and third weeks of March unfolded with increasing frustration and declining hope, was that the strategic situation of Nazi Germany was now entirely hopeless. Not the tactical situation on the Hungarian front, which remained fluid and dangerous, but the larger architecture of the war itself. The British and Americans were crossing the Rhine. The Soviet armies were gathering for their assault on Berlin. And Hitler, in his chambers in Berlin, was still sending orders, still believing that somehow, somewhere, a reversal was possible. The offensive stalled, not because of any single catastrophic moment, but because of accumulated exhaustion meeting mobilized resistance. It stalled because spring mud is indifferent to ideology. It stalled because even elite formations have limits. And it stalled because the enemy, though still bleeding, was also still breathing, still learning, and still growing stronger with each day that passed. By the middle of March, as the German offensive began to lose momentum in the mud and thaw of Hungary, Soviet command was already preparing its answer, and the answer, when it came, would be swift and overwhelming in a way that caught many German commanders almost off guard, even though strategically they should have seen it coming. Marshal Tolbukin, commanding the Soviet 4th Ukrainian Front, and General Chuikov of the 8th Guards Army, had watched the German offensive unfold from positions of strength, not weakness. They had absorbed the initial assault, traded ground where necessary, and all the while kept their reserves hidden and mobile in the forests and valleys beyond the immediate battle zone. It was a pattern the Soviets had perfected over months of fighting in Hungary and Romania. Let the Germans come, bleed them, then strike from unexpected quarters with numbers that seemed to materialize almost as if from the earth itself. By mid-March, the German thrusts had stalled. Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, had consumed vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and the lives of thousands of men. The 6th SS Panzer Army in the north had managed only modest territorial gains. The 2nd Panzer Army in the south had similarly failed to break through to Budapest or achieve the sweeping encirclement that Hitler had envisioned. The Wehrmacht was exhausted. Tank crews had been in almost continuous action for weeks. Infantry units were depleted. Casualties were mounting. Supply lines, stretched across hundreds of kilometers of contested territory, were becoming increasingly fragile. And then, just as the Germans were preparing for renewed assaults, the Soviets struck. The Vienna Offensive, as it would later be called, began on March 16, 1945, with a force and a scope that seemed almost to defy comprehension. Soviet mechanized columns and infantry armies swept westward out of Hungary toward the Austrian border, not to relieve Budapest, that city had fallen weeks earlier, but to drive the Germans back entirely, to seize territory, and to push the front itself toward Vienna and beyond. It was less a localized counterthrust and more a comprehensive reversal of momentum on the entire southern section of the Eastern Front. The Germans had gambled everything on their spring offensive. They had stripped reserves from other sectors, recalled units from the Ardennes, concentrated tanks and assault guns that could not be replaced. And now, facing a Soviet counteroffensive of immense weight and sophistication, they had almost nothing left to give. The collapse of German positions was not instantaneous, but it was swift. Soviet T-34 tanks, increasingly modernized with better armor and firepower, swept forward in coordination with mechanized infantry and supporting artillery. German panzer units fought rearguard actions, but there were fewer of them now, and their crews were fatigued. Equipment losses had been severe. Fuel remained a chronic problem. In some areas, German divisions found themselves fighting in reverse, defending positions they had only recently captured, their ammunition dumps running dry, their air support increasingly scarce as the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain any meaningful presence at all. One might wonder how a military machine of Germany's caliber could collapse so rapidly in a span of days. The answer lies partly in logistics, partly in numbers, but partly also in morale and the erosion of will. The German soldiers fighting in Hungary in March 1945 knew, on some level, that the war was lost. They had watched the Americans cross the Rhine to the west. They had heard rumors of Soviet armies massed in the east. They knew the Luftwaffe could no longer protect them from the air. And yet they continued to fight, not because they believed victory was possible anymore, but because the machinery of obedience still functioned, because their officers still gave orders, because the habit of discipline still held in many units. But discipline is a fragile thing when the fundamental circumstances have become hopeless. The SS Panzer Divisions, those elite units that had been rushed to Hungary with such fanfare and expectation, began to fall back alongside regular Wehrmacht formations. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 6th SS Panzer Army's flagship, fought hard but could not stem the Soviet tide. Das Reich Division, badly mauled already, was pushed westward in a series of exhausting engagements. The Hohenstaufen and other divisions that had come from the Ardennes front, hoping perhaps to restore their fortunes and redeem their failed winter offensive, found themselves instead caught in another catastrophic retreat. Viking Division, with its long history of service on the Eastern Front, withdrew again toward the west, toward territories it had held years earlier, before the great German defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk. It must have felt, to men who had served in these units for years, almost like a nightmare cycle. Advance, hope, retreat, despair, over and over again. The retreat westward unfolded not as an orderly withdrawal, but as a grinding, desperate process of disengagement. Soviet columns pressed relentlessly. German units fought delaying actions from fortified positions, trying to buy time for comrades to fall back and reorganize. Railway lines and roads became choked with refugees, Hungarian civilians fleeing the Soviet advance, German administrative personnel, the vast tale of an army in dissolution. Supply convoys struggled to keep pace. Wounded men were loaded onto whatever vehicles could be spared. Equipment that could not be moved was destroyed to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. The landscape of Hungary, already scarred by months of war and occupation, became a scene of accelerating chaos. The swiftness of the Soviet advance into Austria itself, crossing the border within days of the offensive's opening, demonstrated just how completely German resistance had broken down. Vienna would fall to Soviet forces within a matter of weeks. The grand strategic plan that had moved Hitler to concentrate tanks and elite divisions in Hungary, the vision of a grand offensive that would restore German fortunes in the south and preserve the Reich's precious oil supplies, had evaporated like morning mist. Instead, the Soviets were now driving westward, and with each passing day, the prospect of Soviet armies meeting American forces somewhere in the heart of Europe became less a theoretical possibility and more an approaching inevitability. What remains striking, even now, is the rapidity with which apparent strength can dissolve into collapse when the underlying conditions have rotted away. The German divisions retreating from Hungary in late March 1945 were still capable of causing casualties and inflicting damage on their pursuers, but they were no longer capable of shaping events. They were no longer masters of their own fate. They could only react to Soviet moves, defend ground briefly, then fall back again. And as they fell back, as the front lines shifted westward day after day, the end game of the war in Europe was being written not in Hitler's headquarters or in the rooms of German generals, but in the mud and smoke of Hungary and the advancing eastern plains. By mid-March, the men who had once believed themselves invincible were learning a harder truth. The 6th SS Panzer Army, which had rolled into Hungary with fanfare and the confidence of veteran formations, found itself bleeding away in the mud and slush of the Hungarian plain. The snow that had fallen early in the campaign was now melting into an almost impassable morass, and the tanks that had seemed so mighty when perfectly maintained were becoming monuments to exhaustion and entropy. Consider what happens to a machine when it is pushed beyond its design. A Panther or Tiger tank requires precise maintenance, constant lubrication, skilled crews who understand every mechanical subtlety. But by late March 1945, these vehicles were not being serviced by well-trained technicians in proper facilities. They were being kept running by exhausted men working in the field, often without adequate replacement parts, sometimes without proper tools. Gearboxes failed, transmissions seized. The constant vibration of cross-country movement, combined with the corrosive mud and the stress of combat, wore on these machines as surely as it wore on their crews. The loss of equipment was not merely a matter of statistics. Each tank that broke down and could not be recovered represented a small death. These were not just machines to the men who crewed them. They were armor, sanctuary, the difference between life and whatever lay beyond. When a Panther bogged down irretrievably, when a Tiger slipped sideways into a ravine, or was abandoned because fuel could no longer reach it, something in the collective consciousness of the division shifted. The myth of superiority, so carefully cultivated, so essential to morale, began to erode. By the end of March, The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had lost perhaps half of its operational tank strength. The Das Reich Division, which had arrived in Hungary with considerable armoured capacity, was reduced to a fraction of its fighting force. The Hohenstaufen, the Viking, the Totenkopf, each of these storied formations that had carved their names into the history of the Eastern Front, found themselves scrounging for vehicles, consolidating companies, and turning infantry platoons into makeshift anti-tank teams because they no longer had the armour to sustain traditional operations. This was not the way these men had been trained to imagine their war ending. Many of them had survived years of combat. They had seen Moscow, had fought through the steppes, had endured the grinding attrition of Kursk. They were not inexperienced conscripts broken by their first taste of fire. These were hardened veterans, men who had learned to move under fire, to navigate terrain, to survive conditions that might have shattered newer soldiers. And yet, something in the Hungarian campaign was different. It was not that the enemy was stronger, though Soviet reserves and the gathering weight of Soviet armour certainly constituted a formidable threat. It was that the futility had become too visible to ignore. A tank commander in the 6th SS Panzer Army in late March might have looked around and seen something that shattered whatever remaining faith he possessed. Equipment was breaking down faster than it could be replaced. Casualties were mounting. The intelligence reports spoke of Soviet formations not retreating, but rather regrouping, reinforcing, preparing fresh offensives. Food was becoming scarcer. Ammunition was being rationed. The supply lines, always precarious, were being stretched impossibly thin. And perhaps most corrosive of all, every man knew what was happening. In this age before total information control, despite the Nazi state's efforts to manage narrative, soldiers talked. They understood. They could see with their own eyes that the campaign was not proceeding as promised. The psychological toll on these veteran soldiers was profound and multifaceted. There is a particular anguish that comes to men who have survived extraordinary hardship by clinging to belief in ultimate victory, only to watch that belief dissolve in real time. Some soldiers turned inward, becoming mechanical in their movements, performing their duties without engagement, a kind of waking numbness that was perhaps the mind's self-protection. Others grew defiant or angry at their officers, angry at the high command, angry at the war itself and the way it had consumed their youth and their nation. Still others began to calculate their odds of survival in ways they had not calculated before, wondering whether continued fighting served any purpose beyond delaying the inevitable. The desertion rate, though carefully concealed in official records, was rising. Young men who had once volunteered with ideological fervour or who had been conscripted into these elite formations were quietly slipping away into the forests and villages of Hungary. Some made their way toward Austria, some hid. Some attempted to surrender to Western forces in hopes of better treatment than they might receive from the Soviets. For a soldier to abandon his unit, particularly in an SS formation where desertion was theoretically punishable by death, requires a threshold of desperation to be crossed. The fact that this threshold was being crossed with increasing frequency among the SS Panzer Divisions speaks to the depth of the collapse in morale. There were still fanatics, still committed ideologues who believed in the Nazi cause even as it crumbled. There were still officers who barked orders and expected obedience. There were still small groups of men who fought with stubborn ferocity, who refused to yield, who seemed animated by some mixture of pride, fear, and ingrained military discipline. But as a cohesive force with unified purpose, the great SS Panzer Divisions were disintegrating. They were becoming collections of frightened, exhausted men riding in deteriorating machines toward an end that was no longer in doubt. The equipment losses accelerated as March turned toward April. Fuel shortages became critical. Tank movements had to be rationed and calculated with desperate precision. At one point, Entire panzer companies were simply abandoned because there was no fuel to move them and insufficient infantry to defend them adequately. The men who walked away from these vehicles did so in sullen silence, or so the historical records suggest, leaving behind machines that represented the height of German engineering and the last tangible remnants of German military power. Within the units themselves, the social fabric was fraying. Officers who had once inspired loyalty through force of personality or demonstrated competence were sometimes viewed with suspicion now. Were they committed to survival or to ideology? Were they going to waste men's lives for a war that was already lost? Conversely, some soldiers transferred their loyalty toward their immediate comrades, the men in their tank crew, the soldiers in their squad, moving through the days in a small circle of mutual dependence and diminishing trust in any larger purpose. This is the texture of military collapse when it occurs not suddenly in a single catastrophic battle, but gradually across weeks of mounting pressure and slow erosion of capacity. It is measured not simply in lost tanks or reduced manpower, but in the hardening of faces, the distancing of eyes, the invisible psychological retreat that occurs when men have survived too much and reached the end of their reserves of hope. As the Spring Awakening offensive collapsed into mud and confusion across Hungary in mid-March, the reports filtering back to Adolf Hitler's command bunker in Berlin grew progressively bleaker. Supply lines were stretched beyond reason. Soviet reserves appeared to materialize faster than German intelligence had predicted. The gains, so modest and hard-won, were already beginning to slip away. And in those final weeks of the Third Reich, when every kilometer lost felt like a physical wound to the man who had staked everything on perpetual conquest, Hitler's response to failure hardened into something approaching biblical fury. The Führer had placed extraordinary faith in the Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions as the instrument of his last great hope. They were, in his mind, the ideological elite, the men who had been shaped since youth to embody the racial and martial virtues he believed would transform the course of the war. When Operation Spring Awakening stalled, when the 6th SS Panzer Army failed to achieve the breakthrough that might have secured Hungary's oil fields and perhaps even altered the momentum on the Eastern Front, Hitler did not respond with a strategic reassessment. Instead, he responded with rage, and he chose to express that rage in a manner that was, for him, deeply personal and symbolically laden. On March 28, 1945, Hitler issued an order stripping the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler of its honor title. The Leibstandarte, you must understand, had been Hitler's personal guard unit since the early days of the Nazi movement. It was the oldest of the SS Panzer Divisions, the institution most directly connected to Hitler himself, the unit that bore his own name. To remove that name was not a mere administrative reshuffling. It was an act of public humiliation designed to communicate to the entire Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS that even the closest, the most loyal, the most ideologically pure were not exempt from the Führer's judgment when they failed to deliver absolute victory. The language of the order itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Hitler did not simply demote or reorganize the unit. He declared that the Leibstandarte had lost the right to wear the cuffband bearing his name, the very symbol that identified them as the elite guard. The order was meant to be read throughout the German military establishment as a rebuke not only to one division, but to the entire concept that loyalty and ideology alone could overcome the material facts of defeat. Yet, in its fury, it revealed something else as well, something almost plaintive, the desperation of a man watching the machinery of his power and his vision crumble, and striking out at the only target still within reach. What makes this moment particularly poignant, if one can use such a word for the actions of a man responsible for catastrophic suffering, is the context in which it occurred. The Leibstandarte had not failed because of cowardice or lack of commitment. The men of that division, and the thousands of Waffen-SS soldiers fighting across Hungary, were among the most experienced and dedicated troops remaining to the German cause. Many had fought on multiple fronts, had survived years of warfare, had repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to fight to the last man. They had fought Spring Awakening with genuine tactical skill and courage. What they lacked was not will but material advantage, numerical superiority, the basic advantages that enable military success. Yet Hitler, in his worldview, could not conceive of failure stemming from objective circumstance. Failure had to stem from betrayal, from insufficient commitment, from the degradation of the racial and ideological purity he believed was the engine of military power. The stripping of the Leibstandarte's title serves as a strange crystallization point in the narrative of the German war machine's final months. It is a moment when symbolism and reality collide in particularly stark fashion. Here is a man, in his final bunker, losing control of armies across half of Europe, and his response is to engage in a symbolic punishment of the very unit most identified with him personally. The order itself had almost no practical military effect. The division continued to fight, continued to exist, continued to bear the skills and training it had always possessed. But the blow to morale, the public declaration that even the Leibstandarte was now regarded as suspect, rippled through the SS officer corps and beyond. One might ask, in the quiet of this hour, what possessed Hitler to take such an action at such a moment? Perhaps it was a desperate attempt to restore order through the assertion of absolute authority, a reminder that he remained the source of all legitimacy and all judgment, even as the material foundations of that authority crumbled. Perhaps it was a genuine belief that failure could be punished away, that declaring a unit disgraced would somehow alter the physical conditions on the Hungarian battlefields. Or perhaps it was something more primal, a need to express rage against an outcome he could not control or accept, directed at the institution most bound to him by history and ideology. The dissolution of the Leibstandarte's honor status is, in a broader sense, emblematic of what was happening to the entire German military apparatus in these final months of the war. The grand institutions, the carefully constructed hierarchies, the symbols and titles and ranks that had seemed to represent something eternal and immutable, were coming unstuck. They were being revealed as contingent upon military success, upon the ability to project power and victory. Once that power began to fail, the symbolism that had surrounded it fell away like paint peeling from a rotting structure. The Leibstandarte would fight on without its name. The Wehrmacht would continue to exist without its supposed moral superiority. The Waffen-SS would persist through the final weeks of the war as a ghost of itself, impressive in its survival, but hollow in its once assured sense of destiny. This stripping of honor reveals something essential about the nature of the regime Hitler had built. It was a system in which authority rested entirely upon the person of the Führer and his ability to maintain an aura of infallibility. When that aura cracked, when failure became undeniable, the entire structure of meaning and legitimacy began to crumble from within. The Leibstandarte would carry on, would fight in Austria, would eventually surrender, but it would do so as a unit diminished in official standing, if not in actual capability. The men who wore the uniform would know that they had been judged and found wanting by the man who had raised them up. And yet, there is something almost mournful in contemplating this moment, even from the vantage point of history. These were men who had been molded by an ideology of absolute loyalty and absolute commitment. Many of them were young, indoctrinated from adolescence, shaped by the institutions of the Nazi state. When that state, through its leader, declared them disgraced, they could not simply walk away or reject that judgment. They were bound to it by everything they had been taught to believe about themselves and their role in history. The symbolic punishment had cut deeper perhaps, than any tactical defeat could have done. By the middle of March, the momentum that the German High Command had promised, that sense of invincibility they'd convinced themselves would return when elite panzer units committed to Hungarian soil, had begun its slow, irreversible collapse. The Soviet reserves, which had been moving like a tide beneath the surface, began to break through in multiple locations, and what had started as a German offensive became, almost imperceptibly at first, a fighting retreat. The commanders of these once storied divisions, men who had survived years of the Eastern Front, understood the signs. They had seen it before, the moment when quantity overcomes quality, when fuel runs dry, when reinforcements no longer arrive. And now, in the dampening fields of central Hungary, as April approached with its tentative spring rains, that moment had undeniably arrived. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the division that had served as the personal guard of the Führer himself, found itself leading a retreat that felt almost surreal in its reversal. Soldiers who had once symbolized the promise of Nazi invincibility were now moving westward, back toward the borders of a shrinking Reich, through villages they had occupied mere weeks before. The Soviet forces, no longer pushed back by German steel, pressed forward with a methodical, overwhelming force. Entire German formations were broken up, scattered, reformed into smaller battle groups that lacked the cohesion and firepower they had once possessed. Tanks that had survived the initial assaults were abandoned for lack of fuel, not captured, but deliberately destroyed by their own crews to prevent Soviet seizure. A soldier crouching beside a burning Panther or Tiger, using a demolition charge to destroy a machine he had fought so hard to keep operational, faced a particular kind of despair. What had been a symbol of German technological mastery became, in its burning end, a symbol of something else entirely. The Das Reich Division, which had fought its way northward from occupied France, which had carried out unspeakable acts in pursuit of Nazi ideology, now found itself retreating through the same Hungarian landscape it had traversed with such confidence only weeks before. The men within these units were increasingly conscripts, replacements who had joined late in the war, mixed with the hard core of SS veterans whose commitment to the regime remained, even now, unwavering, or at least professionally maintained. The question of belief versus survival became increasingly muddled as the retreat accelerated. Some soldiers fought because they had been indoctrinated since childhood. Others fought because they were afraid of what the Soviets would do if captured. Still others fought simply because they had orders, and in the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, orders were not optional things. They were the structure upon which everything was built. The Hohenstaufen Division, which had been hastily reformed and sent south from the Ardennes, found itself in a particularly difficult situation. Many of its men had retreated once already from the failed winter offensive in Belgium. They were exhausted in a way that sleep could not remedy. Their vehicles were worn. Their officers, many of them killed or wounded in previous campaigns, had been replaced by younger men who lacked the battlefield experience their predecessors had possessed. The Soviet artillery, meanwhile, seemed endless. Where German artillery had become intermittent, constrained by dwindling ammunition supplies, Soviet guns thundered continuously, day and night, pulverizing positions and forcing German units into perpetual, disorganizing retreats. The Wiking Division, which had drawn its recruits from across Scandinavia and other parts of occupied Europe, faced a particular moral and practical problem. These men were volunteers, in the sense that they had joined the Waffen-SS, many of them believing in a genuine cause, or seduced by promises of adventure and martial glory. Now, as the cause collapsed and adventure had transformed into exhaustion and futility, they faced the question of what happened to foreign volunteers when the regime they had volunteered for ceased to exist. Would they be treated as soldiers or as war criminals? The uncertainty itself was a weapon, perhaps unintentionally deployed by circumstances, that kept many of them fighting even as the rational calculus of the war had become obviously, unmistakably lost. The roads leading westward from Hungary toward Austria became increasingly clogged with retreating German forces. Panzer divisions that had once moved with precision and speed found themselves grinding forward in stops and starts, competing for road space with Wehrmacht units, with supply convoys, with remnants of other formations that had been shattered beyond usefulness. The civilians in villages along these routes watched in a kind of stunned silence as the tide reversed. Many of them had been promised final victory. They had been told that German arms would overcome all obstacles. Now they watched the embodiment of that promise collapse in real time, and there was nothing left to believe in. As the retreating columns pushed into Austria, the geography itself began to offer some natural defensive positions. The terrain became more mountainous, more broken, offering places where a skilled commander with sufficient troops might slow or even temporarily halt a pursuer. But there were no sufficient troops. There was only exhaustion, attrition, and the knowledge that the borders of Germany itself were now not distant abstractions, but imminent realities. Some soldiers began to think, perhaps for the first time, about what would happen after the war. Would they face trial? Would they be executed? Would they simply disappear into displaced persons' camps? Or would they, by some miracle, escape into the chaos and start again somewhere? These thoughts, dangerous thoughts in a regime that demanded absolute loyalty unto death, began to surface in conversations and silent reflections. The final battles for Hungary itself took place in late March and early April, along a shifting line that ran generally north to south, from the Austro-Hungarian border down toward the Yugoslav frontier. Cities and towns changed hands multiple times as German units counterattacked, trying to stabilize lines, only to be overwhelmed and forced back again. Székesfehérvár, a city of strategic importance, fell to Soviet forces. Graz, deeper in Austria, became a focus of intense fighting. And throughout this period, the panzer divisions that had arrived in Hungary with such high hopes and concentrated force slowly ceased to exist as coherent military formations, breaking apart into company-sized battle groups, then platoon-sized detachments, then individual soldiers moving westward with whatever weapons and equipment they could carry. The question of where, exactly, surrender would occur became increasingly relevant as April progressed. Would these SS Panzer Divisions surrender to the Soviets, whose treatment of SS officers and men was notoriously harsh? Or could they maneuver to surrender to the Americans or British, whose capture seemed marginally less likely to result in immediate execution or prolonged imprisonment? This calculation drove some of the final movements of German units in the closing weeks of the war. Commanders who had fought with fierce determination suddenly became interested in the positions of Allied forces. Routes that led eastward toward Soviet lines were abandoned in favor of routes leading westward. The geography of surrender became as important as the geography of battle. The Leibstandarte, as it retreated through Austria, began to fragment. Some units, under hardcore SS officers, continued fighting almost until the very end, holding positions against impossible odds out of ideology, fear, or a kind of martial fatalism. Other portions of the division, particularly those commanded by officers who had begun to consider the practical realities of the war's end, moved westward more rapidly, seeking areas where American forces were likely to arrive first. By late April, the division had effectively ceased to exist as a unified formation. Perhaps 5,000 men, scattered across multiple locations, identified themselves as remnants of the Leibstandarte. The remaining 3,000 or more were dead, captured, or unaccounted for. The Das Reich division followed a similar trajectory, though some portions of it held defensive lines in southern Austria and northern Yugoslavia for longer than other units, grinding away in positional warfare until Soviet forces finally pushed through and surrounded them. The breakout attempts that followed were costly and ultimately unsuccessful. Survivors, rather than surrendering to Soviet forces, often tried to push westward through Austrian territory, seeking American or British captivity. The roads were filled with such desperate columns, and many of them never reached their intended destinations, being intercepted by Soviet or Yugoslav partisan forces along the way. The surrender itself, when it came, was often prosaic and undramatic. A commander, recognizing that further resistance was impossible, would arrange a meeting with Soviet officers, or, if fortunate enough to be in contact with Western forces, with American or British commanders. Weapons would be laid down. Men would be gathered and, in many cases, immediately separated. Officers were segregated from enlisted men. SS troops were further segregated as the Western Allies and the Soviets both recognized that the Waffen-SS occupied a different category from the regular Wehrmacht. What happened next depended entirely on who had accepted the surrender. Those who surrendered to American forces faced imprisonment in camps, interrogation, and eventually, in some cases, extradition to the Soviet Union or to Yugoslavia for trial. Those who surrendered to Soviet forces often faced death or imprisonment in Soviet camps, where survival rates were low and release was unlikely until long after the war ended, if it occurred at all. For individual soldiers, the end came in vastly different ways. Some men were killed in the final days of combat, dying in skirmishes that had become almost meaningless, fighting to hold a position that would be abandoned within hours. Others were killed during desperate breakout attempts through Soviet lines. Still others simply disappeared into the chaos of late April 1945, their fates unknown, their names remaining on rosters as missing in action or presumed dead. Some were captured during the breakdown of organized resistance and survived to become prisoners of war, facing years of captivity before repatriation. A very few managed to escape entirely, slipping away from their units during the chaos and living quietly in Austria or other parts of Europe, assuming false identities, never quite free of the fear that their pasts might catch up with them. The physical equipment of these great panzer divisions was also scattered and lost. The tanks that had arrived in Hungary with such promise were abandoned on roads when they ran out of fuel, destroyed by their crews to prevent capture, or captured by Soviet forces and added to the Red Army's inventory. Some would later serve in Soviet, Polish, or Czechoslovak armies. Others were dismantled for their technical knowledge. The complex logistics infrastructure that had sustained these divisions, the repair shops, the ammunition depots, the fuel storage, was either destroyed to prevent Soviet capture or fell into Soviet hands. Within weeks, the material manifestation of these elite units had essentially ceased to exist. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound and lasting. These had been men who had been told, for years, that they were part of an elite force that would ensure German victory. They had been subjected to intense ideological indoctrination. They had carried out orders that many have campaigned, and so the Hungarian campaign, when we step back from the months of thunder and the names of divisions and the precise coordinates of failed relief attempts, resolves itself into something quieter and stranger still, a kind of afterimage burned into the landscape long after the last tank had crossed into Austria and the surrender documents were signed. What, then, did Operation Frühlingserwachen truly accomplish, and what does it tell us about the final season of the Third Reich's war on the Eastern Front? One might begin by observing that the very name chosen for this last great German offensive in the south carries an irony so gentle that it almost escapes notice. Spring Awakening, Frühlingserwachen, It was spoken with something like hope in the bunkers and command posts, where men who had already lost everything plotted one more time to reverse the direction of history with columns of armor and artillery. And perhaps that is the most human thing about war's ending. Not the grand strategic miscalculations, or the vast numerical disparities, or the exhaustion of resources, but rather the persistence of hope even in the face of certainties. The German commanders who planned this operation, men like Sepp Dietrich and Otto Wöhler, were not fools. They understood the mathematics of their situation. They knew the Soviet Union still possessed reserves that Germany could not fathom. Yet they ordered the attack anyway, because the alternative, to do nothing, to wait passively for annihilation, seemed somehow worse than the slim possibility of change. There is something almost tender in that, if one can say such a thing about war. But what did the campaign actually achieve? In the starkest terms, it bought nothing but time, and time measured only in days and weeks rather than months. The oil fields at Najikanizha, which had driven so much of the strategic thinking, remained in Soviet hands, or fell into them so swiftly that no meaningful fuel ever reached the German war effort. The Hungarian plain, over which so much blood had already soaked into the soil, simply exchanged one master for another, and the people who lived there continued their suffering under different names. The Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions, those institutions that had begun the war as ideological formations and evolved into something more purely martial, elite, hardened, capable of extraordinary feats of arms, found themselves deployed not to hold some decisive line, but merely to delay an inevitable outcome. They succeeded in that narrow sense. They inflicted casualties. They slowed the Soviet advance, but they did not stop it, and they could not have stopped it, no matter how fiercely their crews fought or how cunningly their officers maneuvered through the mud. And perhaps that is the truth that settles most heavily as we contemplate this campaign at a distance. The Hungarian fighting was not a decisive moment in the larger war. It was not a turning point, because the turn had already come many months before, on the frozen approaches to Stalingrad and in the ruins of Kursk and across the steppes where German divisions had been ground down one after another. By the time Leibstandarte and Das Reich and Totenkopf were being loaded onto trains to head southward from the Ardennes, the outcome of the larger struggle was already written in mathematics and physics and the sheer industrial capacity of nations. What Hungary became, instead, was something more melancholy. It was the epilogue, the final chapter of a long decline, written not in triumph, but in the slow exhaustion of reserves that could never be replaced. Consider the human cost, if we may turn for a moment toward those individuals whose names do not appear in histories. Thousands of young tank crewmen, some barely old enough to grow beards, perished in the mud of Hungarian fields. Thousands of Hungarian civilians died in the crossfire, or from the deprivations of siege and occupation. The city of Budapest itself, by the time its siege concluded, had been reduced to rubble and ashes, and the people within it had endured hunger and bombardment, and the fear that comes from being caught between two vast armies. None of this death changed the outcome of the war. It did not shorten it, though some might argue it prolonged it by drawing German resources away from other fronts. It did not save Germany or preserve the Nazi state. It simply happened, and the dead remained dead, and history moved forward without them. There is a peculiar kind of futility that attaches itself to the final campaigns of lost wars. Unlike the early struggles, which might plausibly have changed history had fortune fallen differently, the final campaigns are almost theatrical in their predetermined quality. We know, as we listen to accounts of these battles, that the outcome was never in doubt. We know that the German forces, however brave and however well-equipped some of their units remained, were fighting against a tide that could not be turned. Yet the soldiers themselves did not have the benefit of that certainty. To them, each defensive position mattered. Each withdrawal felt like a defeat. Each casualty felt like a loss that might have been prevented. And so they fought, many of them, with the same intensity and dedication that their predecessors had shown in the first bright days of invasion, when the war still seemed winnable and the future still seemed open. What does the Hungarian campaign tell us then, when we consider it as a whole? Perhaps it speaks to the nature of militaries and states in their final moments. Institutions, even those facing inevitable destruction, tend not to fold quietly. They do not go gently. Instead, they marshal what resources remain, they commit their most dedicated personnel, they attempt one final grand gesture meant to reverse the course of events. The fact that such gestures are almost always futile does not stop them from being made. If anything, desperation tends to make military leaders more willing to attempt long shots, more willing to commit their elite units to one final roll of the dice. The Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions in Hungary were that final gesture. They were the cream of German military manpower, the veterans of years of bitter fighting, the soldiers who had already survived when so many others had not. To send them to Hungary in early 1945, when the Soviet army was already in Poland and making preparations to assault Berlin itself, was arguably an act of strategic desperation. It was also, one might suggest, an act of faith. Faith that somehow, through superior training or superior fighting spirit or simply superior will, the outcome could still be different. That faith was not rewarded. The divisions fought with courage and skill. They inflicted casualties. They achieved tactical victories. And still they lost. And still they retreated. And still the Reich collapsed around them. There is something in this narrative arc that feels almost classical, almost like the unfolding of a tragedy written long before any of the actors involved understood the parts they would play. The Hungarian campaign was not a tragedy because it was close or because the outcome hung in doubt. It was a tragedy because it involved the commitment of vast human effort and the spilling of vast quantities of blood in the service of a purpose that was already lost, a cause that was already dead, even if no one had quite admitted it yet. And yet it happened. For weeks men fought and died in the mud of a Hungarian winter, turning towards spring, fighting for strategic objectives that would not matter and fighting for a state that would not survive the year. If we think about Hungary's place in the larger history of the Second World War, perhaps we should see it as neither a great victory nor a great defeat, but rather as something more like a final sigh, the last convulsive effort of a dying empire. The campaign did not change the war's trajectory. It did not save any lives in the long term, though one might argue it cost many lives in the short term. It did not preserve anything of lasting value or prevent anything terrible from occurring. But it happened, and in happening, it created a historical record that we can examine and study and reflect upon even now, decades later, when all of those who fought in those frozen fields and muddy valleys have themselves passed away. One wonders, sometimes, what the soldiers themselves thought when they looked back on those weeks in Hungary. Did they feel that their sacrifice had meant something, that it had contributed to some larger purpose? Or did they, with the clarity that often comes with age and distance, recognize the futility of their efforts? We cannot know, of course. The dead cannot speak, and the survivors who committed their recollections to paper tend to focus on the personal rather than the strategic, the friend lost, the near miss with a shell, the taste of thin soup eaten in a foxhole. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the grand historical narratives are less important than the small human stories nested within them. What we can say with certainty is this: the Hungarian campaign represented the last gasp of German armoured power on the Eastern Front. After it failed, there were no more major offensives, no more grand attempts to reverse the tide through superiority of arms or tactics. There was only retreat, and then there was only the end. The panzer divisions that fought in Hungary were among the last intact German units to see combat before the final collapse. By May, when unconditional surrender was signed, some of these divisions had been reduced to a fraction of their paper strength. Others had been destroyed entirely or scattered across multiple fronts. The institutional knowledge they represented, the expertise in armored warfare that had been accumulated over years of fighting, was lost, in large measure, never to be recovered. As we contemplate this history from our vantage point in time, we might reflect on what it means to fight a war that is already lost. We might wonder about the psychology of soldiers who continue to show up, to follow orders, to expose themselves to danger, even when they understand, at some level, that the cause is hopeless. Some of this, certainly, was compulsion. The Nazi regime was not a place where soldiers could simply refuse orders and face no consequences. Some of it was genuine belief, a commitment to the ideology that had been drilled into German soldiers since childhood. But some of it, one suspects, was simply the human tendency to continue in the same direction until forced to stop. Momentum is a powerful thing, and the momentum of the German military, even in 1945, was sufficient to keep it moving forward, or at least to attempt to move forward, even as the ground crumbled beneath its feet. The Hungarian campaign is, in the end, a story about endings. It is a story about what happens when great institutions reach the limits of their power and begin to decline. It is a story about the final struggles of militaries and nations that refuse to accept their own mortality until the very last moment. And it is a story about individuals, soldiers and officers and ordinary people caught in the path of armies, who played out their roles in this grand drama without knowing, perhaps without even being able to imagine, how it would ultimately resolve. The landscape of Hungary, in the years and decades after 1945, slowly healed from the scars of